Section 1. The Wasteland Beneath the Wasteland. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you first step out of a vault. The heavy mechanical door grinds shut behind you, locking away everything familiar, and suddenly you are standing in the open air of a world that ended 200 years ago. The wind moves through the ruins, something shifts in the distance, and the world of Fallout, wide and strange and full of secrets, begins to breathe around you. Most people think they know the Fallout series. They know the Pip-Boy on your wrist, the cheerful Vault Boy grinning through impossible catastrophe, the Geiger counter clicking softly as you move through irradiated corridors. But beneath those familiar surfaces, there is an entire other layer of the wasteland, a layer most players never fully reach. Stories buried so deep that even devoted fans sometimes spend hundreds of hours never finding them. And that is what we are here to explore tonight. We are going through 150 of the most hidden, most quietly remarkable mysteries the Fallout series has ever tucked away. Some of these are secrets the developers planted deliberately, little love letters written in code for anyone curious enough to look. Some of them are accidents that became canon. Some of them are lore threads so carefully concealed that you have to read a terminal entry in the corner of a room in the middle of a map most players never visit. In a game that came out nearly 2 decades ago, just to find the beginning of the story. We will find all of them tonight. So get comfortable, settle in, let the wasteland come to you. The world of Fallout is built on a very specific kind of aesthetic contradiction. On the surface, it is a 1950s paradise gone wrong. Gleaming chrome and pastel colors and the promises of American prosperity, all wrapped around the skeleton of nuclear annihilation. The pre-war world that the games constantly reference through holotapes, posters, and terminal entries was a place of transistor radios and white picket fences, and corporations that reassured everyone everything was fine, right up until it wasn't. That contradiction runs through every piece of world building in the series, and it shows up in the strangest places. Consider Vault-Tec's marketing materials. In Fallout 4, if you take the time to wander through the ruins of the Vault-Tec regional HQ in the Commonwealth, you will find offices still decorated with cheerful propaganda. The posters are bright and optimistic. The slogans are upbeat. And buried in the terminal entries of middle management, you find the bureaucratic reality behind all that cheerfulness. Memos about experiment quotas. Arguments about test parameters. Requests for clarification on ethical oversight. The horror of what Vault-Tec actually was creeps in through the cracks of corporate language. And the contrast between the colorful posters on the wall and the clinical detachment of the emails is one of the most quietly effective pieces of environmental storytelling in the entire series. This technique, telling the real story through contrast, is something Bethesda and Obsidian have both used masterfully throughout the franchise. The world looks one way on the surface. The truth lives in the margins. One of the first hidden details most new players miss is the sheer amount of information encoded in skeletons. Every Fallout game from 3 onward populates its world with skeletal remains, and most players walk right past them. But the developers have placed those skeletons with extraordinary care. In Fallout 3, there is an unmarked farmhouse northeast of Megaton. Inside, you find 2 adult skeletons lying close together on a bed, their hands arranged near each other on the mattress. Beside them, in a small side room, is a child skeleton in a tiny bed. The family died together, sealed in their home when the bombs fell. No quest marker, no holotape, no terminal entry, just the arrangement of bones telling a complete story in absolute silence. This practice of using skeletons as silent storytelling devices is something the developers clearly took seriously. In Fallout New Vegas, there is a location in the hills near Good Springs where you can find a pair of skeletons arranged around a cold campfire, one of them still wearing a pre-war traveling coat. A battered journal nearby tells you this was a father and son who made it out of Las Vegas before the bombs fell, walking west, trying to reach California. They stopped to rest and never got up again. The journal's last entry just says the boy's name, and then nothing after that. The period at the end of his name is the period at the end of the story. Players who walk through these scenes without looking carefully will get nothing from them. Players who slow down will find some of the most emotionally devastating storytelling in modern gaming, told entirely through prop placement and environmental design. One of the most famous hidden environmental stories in Fallout 3 is the one found in the ruins of a house in the DC area, in a location called the Little Lamplight Entrance. On the surface, it's just rubble. But if you look carefully in one of the ruined houses nearby, you will find a skeleton in an armchair in front of a dead television set, its bony hand still holding the remote. Empty bottles of Nuka-Cola are arranged at its feet. On a nearby table is a notepad with a single entry that reads, more or less, that this person has been waiting for the TV channels to come back on for a while now. But surely it will be soon. Surely someone is working on fixing the broadcast signal. The note is dated several months after the bombs fell. This person sat in front of their television and simply waited, as if the apocalypse was a temporary technical problem the networks were going to sort out eventually. It is funny in a way that is deeply sad. The joke is that they were wrong. The punchline is a skeleton, and the whole thing was written by a developer who wanted you to find exactly that feeling in exactly that moment, even though there is no quest attached to it, no reward for noticing it, no achievement for understanding it. Some stories in Fallout exist purely because someone thought they should exist. The original Fallout games, the isometric ones developed by Black Isle Studios in the late 1990s, are full of secrets that most modern players have never encountered. The original Fallout had an entire region that served as a hidden Easter egg. The Sierra Army Depot held references to old science fiction novels, and scattered throughout the Mojave equivalent locations in that era were small touches that rewarded players who knew their 20th century literature. Fallout 2 famously included an entire sequence of pop culture Easter eggs so dense that veteran players still catalog them today. There was a wedding cake with a bride and groom that referenced a specific romantic comedy film. There were characters lifted almost directly from Mad Max. There was a traveling merchant who, if you spoke to him under the right circumstances, would reference several films that had nothing to do with the post-apocalypse and everything to do with the writer's taste in cinema. But the original games also contained something more quietly remarkable: a philosophical consistency. The original Fallout was a game about what happens to institutions after catastrophe. The Master's Plan, the Vault-Tec experiments, the Enclave's belief in its own purity, all of these were written by people asking a genuine question. When society ends, what survives? And the answer the games kept returning to was, the worst of us, dressed in the language of the best. The corrupt bureaucracy. The ideological certainty that would rather destroy than compromise. The corporation that used the apocalypse as a business opportunity. These themes did not originate with Bethesda. They were baked into the DNA of the series from its very first disc. And one of the greatest hidden secrets in all of Fallout is how consistently those original themes have survived into every subsequent entry, even as the gameplay changed dramatically. Let's talk about the Pip-Boy. The Personal Information Processor, Model 3000 in Fallout 3 and 4, is one of the most recognizable pieces of design in gaming. It is a chunky, green-screened wristwatch computer that your character uses to manage inventory, navigate the map, and access stats. Most players treat it as a heads-up display, a menu system, but the Pip-Boy has its own internal logic that is easy to miss. In Fallout 4, if you pay attention to the Pip-Boy's display as you wander, you will notice that the time and date on its screen updates in real time relative to the game world's internal clock. The Pip-Boy is actually tracking the passage of days and hours, and the date display will reflect exactly how long your character has been awake and moving since you started that playthrough. The light that illuminates the screen at night is faint and green and cast upward across your character's face, something you can notice in first-person view if you angle the camera just right. These were deliberate design choices made to reinforce the idea that the Pip-Boy is a real object in a real world, not a menu screen. More interestingly, the sounds the Pip-Boy makes when you navigate its menus change depending on what you are doing. The beeps for accessing stat screens are different from the clicks for inventory management, which are different again from the sounds made when you tune the radio. The sound designers created a sonic language for the device that is internally consistent and never repeated, even though the vast majority of players will never consciously notice that the sound design of a fictional wrist computer is coherent. They did it anyway. That kind of invisible craftsmanship shows up everywhere in these games, if you know how to look. One of the most discussed hidden elements in Fallout lore is the origin story of the Great War itself. The bombs fell on October 23, 2077. That is established canon across every game in the series. But who fired first? The games have never definitively answered that question. And the ambiguity is not an accident. In Fallout 3, terminal entries in the Citadel hint that the US government believed China launched the first strike, but the Brotherhood's own records acknowledge that communications in those final hours were chaotic. In Fallout New Vegas, the Mojave Outpost has old military logs that suggest both sides were on hair-trigger alert for weeks before the actual exchange. In Fallout 4, one of the pre-war news broadcasts you can find on holotapes in the opening minutes of the game is clearly presenting information in a way designed to justify a first strike, suggesting the U.S. government was preparing the public to accept an offensive war as defensive necessity. The question of who fired first in the Great War is deliberately left unanswered because the developers understood something important. It doesn't matter. The world ended anyway. The argument about who fired first is the kind of argument that only matters before the bombs fall. After, it becomes the sort of thing that people argue about in the ruins of civilization while the radiation gets into their water supply. The unanswered question is the point. The fog of war is built into the game's lore on purpose, and that is a more sophisticated piece of storytelling than simply giving you a clear answer. Hidden in the geography of the capital wasteland in Fallout 3 is something that most players drive past without ever noticing. The destroyed city of Washington, D.C. is not randomly arranged rubble. The architects at Bethesda carefully researched the actual layout of Washington's landmarks and built the game's ruined capital around them with considerable accuracy. If you navigate through the city using only landmarks, knowing where the Lincoln Memorial is relative to the Washington Monument, knowing where the mall extends and how it connects to the other museums and government buildings, you are navigating a faithful, if collapsed, recreation of the actual city's geography. This level of fidelity was not required for the game to function. Players did not need the mall's spatial relationships to be accurate, but the developers built it accurately anyway, because they were building a real place. The sense of genuine loss that the DC wasteland creates comes partly from the fact that the player, consciously or not, senses that these broken buildings were real, that the Lincoln Memorial really is this big, that the corridors of the Smithsonian museums really do have this particular relationship to the outdoor spaces. The ruin feels like a ruin of something actual, rather than a generic post-apocalyptic city, and that emotional weight is quietly invisible labor done by the world-building team. One of the quieter mysteries embedded in the Fallout world is the question of what happened to all the animals. Most of the creatures you encounter are mutated: rad scorpions and bloatflies and mirelurks and two-headed cattle called Brahmin. But occasionally you find references to animals that were not mutated, animals that simply survived the war in more or less their original form, living in the margins of the wasteland. In Fallout 3, there is a cat, a single, non-mutated, perfectly ordinary house cat that wandered into the universe of the game, can be found in Rivet City, living in a market stall and being fed scraps by the residents. She has a name. She wanders the ship. The humans who live around her have incorporated her into their community the way humans always incorporate cats into their communities, with a kind of fond exasperation. Nobody explains why there is a normal cat in Rivet City. Nobody gives you a quest about her. She is simply there, being a cat, in the middle of the apocalypse, and if you find her, it is a small, unremarkable miracle. She lives. Among all the ruin, she just lives. It is easy to miss. It is designed to be easy to miss. But the developers put her there, and gave her a name, and made her wander a routine, and the small warmth of that decision is one of the things that makes the Fallout games feel inhabited rather than primarily built. The Mojave Wasteland in Fallout New Vegas contains one of the most remarkable feats of environmental world-building in the series. The sense that time has been passing and civilization has been slowly, unevenly reconstructing itself. The new California Republic is a genuine nation-state. New Vegas is a functioning city. Towns have economies. People have jobs. The chaos of the immediate post-war period has cooled into something that resembles, in a distorted way, a civilization with politics and factions and trade routes and a functioning postal system. Much of this is communicated not through dialogue but through the environment itself. The condition of buildings in different parts of the Mojave tells you something about the status of the communities that occupy them. NCR-controlled territory tends to have better repaired infrastructure. Raider camps are built from salvage. The Strip has genuine electricity. These visual signals accumulate into a picture of a world at different stages of recovery, and the narrative weight of that picture is something most players absorb without ever analyzing. What is remarkable is how much work went into calibrating those visual signals. The art team had to decide exactly how repaired a specific building should look in order to communicate a specific level of community stability without dialogue or explicit signposting. That is extraordinarily delicate work, and it is largely invisible because when it succeeds, you never notice it. You just feel, without being told, that this town is doing better than that one. Before we move on, here is something worth sitting with for a moment. One of the longest-running mysteries in Fallout 4 is the secret that director Todd Howard mentioned at the DICE Summit in 2016. He said casually that there was still a secret in Fallout 4 that no player had found. He mentioned it and then did not elaborate. No one pressed him on specifics. And the Fallout 4 community, which was already extraordinarily dedicated, became consumed with the hunt. Players have spent years combing through every terminal in the game, every room, every NPC's dialogue tree, every holotape, every piece of environmental design. Several promising candidates have been identified over the years. The general consensus, though still unverified, is that the secret may relate to a specific terminal in the Institute, or to a particular sequence of events in Diamond City that requires extremely precise conditions to trigger. As of the most recent examinations of the game, nobody has definitively found it, which means it might still be there. Somewhere in the Commonwealth, something is waiting. Something the developers hid in a world that has been played by millions of people, explored by professional speedrunners and dedicated lore hunters, analyzed frame by frame, and it is still hidden. The Wasteland is patient. That patience is one of the defining qualities of the Fallout series. These are games that reward the player who moves slowly, reads everything, and trusts that the world has more to give if you just keep looking. The mysteries we have covered in this first section are only the beginning. The world beneath the Wasteland goes much, much deeper, and we are just getting started. Take a breath. Let the world keep opening up. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if this kind of quiet, slow exploration of video game worlds is the kind of thing you like to fall asleep to, subscribe so you never miss a new one. We go deep, we go slow, and we go together. Section 2. Developer Fingerprints. Every game made by human beings contains the fingerprints of the people who built it. Most of those fingerprints are invisible, sanded away in polish and revision, absorbed into the finished product so thoroughly that you can no longer tell where the person ended and the product began. But Bethesda Game Studios has a long tradition of leaving deliberate fingerprints, small marks, inside jokes, signatures embedded in the architecture of the Wasteland. Some of them are famous, some of them are almost unknown. All of them are worth finding. Let's start with Codsworth, the cheerful Mr. Handy robot who greets you at the beginning of Fallout 4, polishing a car and asking about breakfast while the apocalypse unfolds on the television inside, has one of the most quietly elaborate Easter eggs in the game tucked into his programming. Codsworth is designed to recognize your player character's name and call you by it. Bethesda's voice actors recorded hundreds of names so that Codsworth could personalize his greeting. The officially released list of names he recognizes includes the expected things, common first names, and some things you might expect from a Bethesda game, references to other Bethesda titles, a handful of clearly in-joke options. But the list also includes the names Fallout, and Fallout 3, and Fallout 4, and remarkably, Fallout 5. The developers had Codsworth programmed to recognize a game that did not yet exist at the time Fallout 4 was released. Whether this was wishful thinking, a placeholder, or a deliberate statement about the franchise's future is something nobody from Bethesda has ever fully clarified. Codsworth will cheerfully call you Fallout 5, as if it is a completely ordinary name, which in his world it presumably is. He will also respond to Todd Howard, the name of Bethesda's game director. He recognizes it and reacts to it, which means somewhere in the voice recording sessions, an actor said the name of the studio's executive producer in the context of a fictional British robot addressing his employer, and everyone involved decided this was acceptable and should ship in the final product. It did. The name Dinnerbone is an Easter egg that originated in a different game entirely, but the tradition of developers hiding their own names or the names of figures they respect is one that Bethesda has carried forward in Fallout in its own particular way. Throughout Fallout 3 and 4, many of the NPCs with distinctive names have names that came from inside the studio. Junior developers who suggested names for random merchants, a QA tester whose first name was used for a minor character in a side quest, The Wasteland's population of named figures contains a quiet running joke about the human cost of making video games, because all those people who would never be famous enough to appear in the credits prominently are in there somewhere, living as NPCs in a world that ended 200 years ago. One of the better-known examples is Preston Garvey. Not that the character was named after anyone specific on the team, but the writing of Preston's dialogue went through such an unusual amount of internal discussion at Bethesda that his role became something of a studio legend. The joke, which has persisted in gaming culture for years, is that Preston will give you an endless stream of settlement quests. What is less known is that this behavior was a conscious design decision made specifically to communicate the scale and scope of the settlement system by giving you tangible human stakes for maintaining multiple locations. The developers knew it would become a meme. They shipped it anyway, because they believed the underlying design was sound. This is a very human kind of stubbornness that turns up in a lot of Fallout's development stories. The alien blaster in Fallout 3 exists in a location that was placed with tremendous care. To find it in the base game, you need to go to a specific area northeast of the MDPL-13 power station and find a crashed UFO that is easy to miss because it is positioned to look like scattered debris from a distance. The gun is exceptional, but what is more interesting than the gun is the series of decisions that led to it being there. The Fallout franchise has always had a complicated relationship with actual extraterrestrials. The original games included alien references primarily as Easter eggs and jokes. Fallout 3 leaned into this more heavily, eventually including a DLC called Mothership Zeta that took the player aboard an alien spacecraft, which proved to be one of the more divisive add-ons in the game's history. But the base game Easter egg, the crashed UFO with the alien blaster, predates all of that. It was placed in the world before the DLC was greenlit, before the alien storyline was expanded. It was just a fun thing that someone decided to hide in the game for curious explorers. The interesting part is the location. It was placed in an area that requires significant map knowledge to reach, because there is no quest that takes you there, no road that leads directly to it, no obvious landmark nearby. You can only find it if you are the kind of player who walks deliberately off the beaten path, who says, "I wonder what is over there," and then goes to find out. The alien blaster was designed to reward exactly that behavior. It is a gift for curiosity. The developers hid it because they believed, correctly, that someone would eventually choose to look. Bethesda has a long tradition of hiding developer rooms in their games. These are spaces accessible via console commands that contain every item in the game laid out on shelves, used for internal testing. Players occasionally find ways to access these rooms without cheats, and when they do, they find something strange and intimate. The skeleton of the game exposed, all its items laid out with the practical clarity of a warehouse, none of the drama or narrative context that surrounds those items in the actual world. Stepping into a developer room in a Bethesda game is like stepping behind the curtain of a theater and seeing the stage machinery up close. In Fallout 76, the developer room became the subject of one of the more remarkable stories in the franchise's history. The game launched in November 2018 and, unlike previous Bethesda titles, was exclusively online, meaning console commands were not an accessible cheat option. However, some players found a way to access the developer room through a sequence of exploit-based maneuvering that nobody outside the studio had anticipated. They found the room. They found every item in the game. And they took things. Bethesda became aware of this and reached out to the players who had accessed the room. The studio had to identify exactly which players had been there and what they had taken, which meant reconstructing the chain of events by which a testing space, designed to be invisible to ordinary users, had become accessible. The conversation that apparently followed, according to reports from the time, involved Bethesda asking those players to explain how they had done it in exchange for some form of account consideration. The players who had accessed the developer room had essentially discovered a flaw in the architecture of a game that was supposed to be entirely server-controlled, and the studio was in the awkward position of needing information from the people who had exploited that flaw. It was a very human moment in the history of a very large company. In Fallout 4, scattered across Diamond City's bulletin board, and in conversations with various NPCs, there is an ongoing argument about whether the city's mayor, McDonough, is a synth. This is, of course, a reference to a real quest in the game, and it connects to the broader Institute-related storyline. But what is less noticed is that the debate is also a meta-reference. Bethesda built a paranoid community that cannot determine whether one of its members is a machine pretending to be human, and they built it into a game that features a protagonist who may also be a synthetic human. The community's argument is a small mirror of the game's larger questions. The mayor's name, McDonough, is also a reference. John McDonough was a historical politician who was notably associated with some controversial stances in early American history, and the use of that name for a self-serving, paranoid political figure in a post-apocalyptic city is the kind of deep-cut historical joke that Bethesda's writers clearly enjoyed making. It would take a specific kind of history knowledge to catch it, which means most players never do. It was written for someone who would notice. Someone probably did. Everyone else got a perfectly functional antagonist without ever understanding the octagonal layer. The mysterious stranger is one of the oldest running jokes in the Fallout series. He appears in VATS when you have a certain perk equipped, materializing from nowhere to deliver a devastating shot and then vanishing before you can get a look at him. He has appeared in every main series Fallout game. He wears the same coat, the same hat. His identity has never been explained. In Fallout 4, for the first time, the game acknowledges the mysterious stranger through something other than his appearance. In Nick Valentine's detective agency, there is a case file. Nick has been investigating the mysterious stranger. There are notes, photographs, observations, and what the case file reveals, carefully and ambiguously, is not who the mysterious stranger is, but rather how many appearances have been documented across the wasteland, in the capital wasteland, in the Mojave, in the Commonwealth. Multiple sightings over multiple decades. Always the same coat. Always the same hat. Always gone before anyone could speak to him. The implication, never stated directly, is that the mysterious stranger is not entirely mortal. He is older than he should be. He moves between regions in ways that suggest either extraordinary resources or something stranger. Nick's notes don't reach a conclusion. The case file is never resolved. The investigation just stops. As if even Nick Valentine, who has been around the Commonwealth for a very long time, found this particular case too slippery to pin down. The mysterious stranger remains a mystery. He was always meant to. One of the cleverest hidden developer signatures in Fallout 4 is the Hubris Comics connection. Hubris Comics is a Boston-area company in the game's universe that published superhero comics, most notably the Silver Shroud series. The Silver Shroud himself appears as a quest in Fallout 4, involving a costume and a radio drama. But if you dig into the actual Hubris Comics headquarters, accessible in Boston's financial district, and read all the terminal entries, you find a picture of the comics industry in the pre-war era that is remarkably detailed and rather cynical. The terminal entries discuss editorial disputes, creator rights controversies, attempts to squeeze more content from popular characters against the creator's wishes, and a management culture that clearly valued intellectual properties over the people who created them. This is a parody of real-world comics industry history, done with enough specificity that it reads as satire written by people who had opinions about those industries. It is entirely optional content hidden in a building most players never fully explore, but it is there, fully written, internally consistent, and pointed. Someone wrote it because they wanted to. Fallout 3 includes an Easter egg that requires you to know your 80s science fiction well enough to recognize it. In the Dunwich building, one of the game's creepiest interiors, a dark and distorted place full of feral ghouls and strange environmental details. The name Dunwich itself is a Lovecraft reference. H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror is a story about a place where something ancient and wrong seeps into ordinary reality. The building shares that quality. Things feel wrong inside it in a way that is hard to articulate but is consistent throughout. Hidden in the depths of the building are sound effects and environmental details that do not appear anywhere else in the game. A whispered voice saying something that is just below intelligible. A visual hallucination triggered under specific conditions. The building is designed to make you feel like something is watching you, and the attention to detail in creating that feeling extends to areas of the building that most players will flee before fully exploring because the enemies there are too high level for typical first visits. The reference extends beyond the building's name. The surrounding area in the capital wasteland has its own quiet strangeness if you know where to look. There is an obelisk in the landscape near the building that serves no mechanical purpose. There are small markers, unreferenced by any quest, that suggest a ritual or burial of some kind. The Lovecraftian influence is not confined to the building itself, but leaks into the geography around it, the way a bad dream bleeds into the space around the sleeping body. The real-world city of Boston is full of history, and Fallout 4's version of the city, called the Commonwealth, is filled with references to that history layered into the post-apocalyptic overlay. The game's version of Fenway Park becomes Diamond City, which is the Commonwealth's largest settlement. The choice of Fenway is not random. It is one of the most recognizable structures in Boston, and using it as the community's anchor gives players who know Boston a familiar foundation beneath all the ruin. Players who know the actual park's layout will recognize the arrangement of the seating areas and the diamond itself, preserved beneath the settlement's construction. But more subtly, the game populates Diamond City with references to Boston's actual cultural identity. The attitudes of the residents, their toughness and their loyalty, and their resistance to outsiders mirrors a self-image that Boston has always cultivated. NPCs in Diamond City speak with a cadence that is clearly inspired by the specific rhythms of working-class Boston English. The voice directors made a point of getting the accent and the attitude right, and the result is a settlement that feels like it could have grown from the actual cultural soil of that specific city, rather than being a generic post-apocalyptic settlement placed over a famous landmark. One of the most poignant developer Easter eggs in the franchise is found in Fallout New Vegas, in the Gunrunner's Arsenal vendor. Among the weapons available, there is one called That Gun, a unique pistol that is a direct reference to the famous 223 pistol from the original Fallout. It is not just a visual callback. The weapon model was recreated with care, and the name is the name, understated and a little rueful, of something from a game that was made in a completely different era by people who are no longer working together in the same way. Chris Avallone, one of the principal writers on New Vegas, has spoken about the importance of continuity in the Fallout series, about the responsibility that comes with being handed a world that other people built with their own ideas and passions. That gun is a small act of that responsibility. It says, "We remember where we came from. We are still connected to what this was before we got here." The gun is named with what sounds like a dismissive gesture but is actually a very precise one. That gun is the gun. The one from the beginning. The one that started a conversation that is still happening 2.5 decades later. Section 3. Cut from the wasteland. Every finished game is built on the ruins of the game it almost was. The features that were cut, the characters who were written and voiced and then removed, the locations that were designed and detailed and then paved over by something else. These ghosts live in the game files long after they have been removed from the actual experience, and dedicated data miners have spent years excavating them. In Fallout New Vegas, the cemetery of Almost Was is extraordinarily rich. Obsidian had 18 months to make the game, which is an almost impossibly short timeline for a project of that scale, and the evidence of what was left behind in the rush is scattered through the game files like the remnants of a city that was abandoned mid-construction. The most significant piece of cut content in New Vegas involves a Securitron named Marilyn Mr. House. The enigmatic technologist who controls New Vegas from his tower had a collection of Securitrons programmed with distinct personalities. In the final game, you meet Securitrons named Victor and a few others, but Marilyn was removed before release. Her voice lines were recorded, her personality was written. She was fully realized as a character, a Securitron programmed with the personality of Marilyn Monroe, placed in the Lucky 38 as a companion or ambient presence for House. The early beta build discovered by the YouTube channel Games is Past in late 2025 confirmed that Marilyn was present and functional just 1 month before the game shipped. She had voice lines, she had animations, she had a relationship with the Lucky 38's environment, and then she was cut, probably for time or for scope, in the final weeks of development. The discovery of this beta build, which is approximately 2 gigabytes larger than the shipped version, has given modders enough material to begin restoring Marilyn to the game using the original assets. She is, in a sense, being resurrected from the game files by people who never knew her when she was alive. The Marilyn mod restored her voice lines. Some of them are charming. Some are surprisingly melancholy for what was presumably designed as a light-hearted ambient character. This is one of the strange things about cut content. It often has a quality to it that the finished product does not, because it was never polished down into something safe and final. The edges are still there. The rawness is still there. Marilyn in the beta build feels like an unfinished painting, which is its own kind of beauty. There was also, in early builds of Fallout New Vegas, a planned chase sequence involving Benny, the charismatic casino manager who shoots you in the head in the game's opening. In the shipped version, you find Benny at the Tops Casino, and the confrontation is primarily verbal and eventually violent depending on your choices. But in the cut version, there was an additional sequence planned after the initial encounter. Once Benny realized you had found him, he was supposed to run, through Yes Man's room, through a series of corridors rigged with explosives, along a path that led, intriguingly, through an area that appeared to connect to an entrance to Vault 21. This would have revealed something important about how Benny moved around New Vegas without Mr. House noticing. The explosive corridor chase would have been both a set piece and a piece of lore delivery, showing us that Benny had his own private route through the city, his own secret infrastructure that allowed him to operate independently of the official systems. The chase was cut, and with it went one of the most interesting implied answers to the question of how a man like Benny survives in Mr. House's city. Some data miners believe the corridor still exists in the game's geometry, inaccessible to normal gameplay but present in the world data. Whether this is true or a case of existing corridors being misidentified is something the community continues to debate. But the outline of the chase, the intention behind it, is documented enough in early development notes and voice recordings to be considered reliable historical record. Vault 24 was cut entirely from New Vegas. In the game's lore, the vault is mentioned, referenced in passing in a way that suggests it was intended to be a location you could visit. Data miners found interior design elements that seemed to belong to a vault that had not made it into the final build. Community members have since pieced together, from contextual clues in the surrounding dialogue and environment, what Vault 24's experiment might have been. The leading theory, based on text fragments found in the game files, is that Vault 24 was something to do with biological quarantine, possibly a vault where residents were exposed to various pathogens to test the limits of human immune response. If this is accurate, the vault would have been one of the darker social experiments in the series, which is saying something given the competition. Vault 11, which required residents to vote someone into sacrifice each year, and Vault 92, which drove its occupants mad with subliminal messaging through their audio equipment, are both present in New Vegas. Vault 24, if the theories are correct, would have fit into that tradition of horror dressed in corporate reassurance. We will never visit it. It is one of the saddest facts in Fallout history. A location designed, partially voiced, written into the lore, and then simply not present in the finished game. The door to Vault 24 was sealed before the game came out, and it has been sealed ever since. Papa Khan's armor is another piece of cut content that the New Vegas beta build has now brought to light. In the final game, Papa Khan, the leader of the Great Khan's raider tribe, appears in the quarry hideout wearing standard Great Khan's attire. But in the beta, he wore a distinct set of armor that communicated his leadership status much more visually. The armor was modeled, textured, and apparently in the final days of development was removed and replaced with the more generic outfit. The mod community has restored the armor using the beta's assets. When you see Papa Khan in his intended outfit, his presence reads differently. He feels more like a warlord and less like an elder. The change was presumably made for consistency or for some technical reason, but the result was that a character who is supposed to be a significant political figure in the Mojave lost some of his visual authority. The restored armor makes him look like what he is supposed to be, the head of a clan that considers itself the rightful heirs to a tradition of freedom and violence. The distinction matters. There was a mechanic planned for Fallout New Vegas called the Brotherhood VR Pods. In Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage DLC, the Brotherhood used virtual reality simulation technology to recreate historical battles, allowing you to walk through the simulation of the Anchorage campaign as if you were there. In the Hidden Valley bunker where the Mojave Brotherhood is holed up, there are VR pod units that are present in the environment, but completely non-interactive. Players from Fallout 3 immediately recognized what they were and waited for the ability to use them. The pods were never made interactive, but there are references in the game's code to a VR minigame with a scoring system, dialogue references to Brotherhood training simulations, and what appears to be the skeleton of a gameplay mode that would have involved using the pods to run combat simulations. It was cut, probably because 18 months was not enough time to build a full VR minigame, and also everything else New Vegas needed to be. But the pods sit there in the Hidden Valley bunker, and for players who know what they might have been, they are one of the more haunting pieces of the game's unfinished architecture. Fallout 4 also has its own substantial archive of cut content. There is a notable example centered around a quest that was clearly planned for the Museum of Freedom in Concord, the area you travel to in the early hours of the game. Behind a wall in the museum, accessible only through knowledge of the game's geometry or careful use of specific game mechanics, there is a sealed-off area. Inside that area is an NPC space, a room clearly designed to hold a character, and references in nearby terminal entries to someone who stole a gun and has been hiding. The terminal tells you about the theft. The sealed room implies where the thief went. But there is no quest, no NPC, no gun in the sealed space. It is the architecture of an unmarked quest that was written into the terminal, designed into the space, and then never connected to a functional quest marker. Players who found it, mostly through YouTube videos documenting exploits, were left with the strange experience of finding the setting for a story that never got its characters. The room waited for someone who was never coming. In the world building of Fallout, one of the most systematically cut elements across multiple games is the attempt to show genuine factions of survivors who are neither monsters nor heroes. Fallout New Vegas does this better than any other game in the series through the major factions. The NCR, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, and the Independent option all represent genuine ideological positions rather than simple good versus evil dynamics. But even New Vegas had cuts that would have deepened this picture. One of the most discussed cut elements involves Pahrump, a real town in Nevada that appears on maps and in dialogue references in New Vegas, but is never accessible as a location. Given where it would fall geographically and what we know of the game's intended scope, Pahrump was almost certainly designed as a functioning settlement with its own questline. The evidence suggests it may have been a community that had successfully negotiated an unusual relationship with one of the major factions, something that would have complicated the politics of the Mojave in interesting ways. Cut content enthusiasts have found enough fragments of Pahrump's intended design to feel confident it was a real location with real plans behind it. It simply did not make the timeline. Like many things in New Vegas, it exists in the game's shadow more than in its light. The shadow of what this game was trying to be is almost as interesting as the game itself. Something worth pausing on is the sheer quantity of voice dialogue that was recorded and then cut from various Fallout games. The actors who worked on these projects, many of them seasoned professionals, recorded hours of content for characters who ultimately appear in the games for minutes or not at all. The complete vocal performances of characters like the cut Maryland Securitron represent real creative labor that the public almost never hears. This is one of the reasons the discovery of the New Vegas beta build was so significant to the community. It was not just about the missing armor or the cut locations. It was about access to the work. The creative effort that went into building a game that was always going to be too ambitious for its timeline, preserved in a hard drive that somehow survived. Listening to voice lines that were recorded and never shipped feels oddly like hearing a conversation from another timeline, one where the game had more time, where everything that was planned made it in, where Marilyn stood in the Lucky 38 and commented on the view. That timeline does not exist, but the evidence of it does, and it is being carefully archived by the community that loved the games enough to look for it. Section 4. The lore nobody talks about. There is a difference between Fallout's famous lore and its hidden lore. The famous lore is the stuff that gets discussed on wikis and in YouTube documentaries. The origin of the super mutants, the nature of the Institute, the history of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Vault-Tec experiments. These are the things players expect when they sit down with a Fallout game. But running alongside this official narrative, threaded through the games in terminal entries and holotapes and environmental clues that most players never fully process, there is a stranger, quieter body of lore. Stories that never became quests. Characters who lived and died entirely in text files. Histories that the games acknowledge but never dramatize. These are the stories worth losing sleep over. In Fallout 3, along the western edge of the capital wasteland near the border of the game's accessible map, there is a small camp that belongs to a woman named Isabella Proud. She is not there when you arrive. Her body is nearby. A Geiger counter reading of the local area confirms significant radiation exposure, and her terminal tells a story. Isabella was a scientist, a former employee of a research organization, who became obsessed with understanding the behavior of feral ghouls. She wanted to know if there was any remnant of personhood left in them, any trace of the minds they had once possessed, any possibility of communication or reversal. She and her research partner Jason set up the camp near a significant feral ghoul population and began collecting data. The terminal entries document their work with the careful precision of people who still believed in the scientific method even after the world had largely abandoned it. Then the entries change in tone. Jason was injured in a ghoul encounter. Isabella was frightened but determined. Then Jason's condition worsened. Then an entry that says she thinks she may have made a mistake in her exposure calculations. Then an entry that is just a list of symptoms. Then silence. Her corpse and Jason's corpse are both findable in the surrounding area. Their research, which was apparently quite thorough, amounts to exactly nothing because it was never transmitted to anyone who could use it. It dies with them in an irradiated field outside the game's primary map, in a location most players will never visit. The story is complete and entirely hopeless, and there is not a single thing you can do about it once you have read it. Isabella Proud died doing science after the end of the world, and she died for nothing. And the game asks you to feel that weight without ever asking you to do anything about it. The history of the town of Andale in Fallout 3 is one of the most quietly disturbing pieces of storytelling in the capital wasteland. Andale is located just south of Fairfax, and when you first arrive, it seems remarkably pleasant. A few families, well-maintained houses, good food available. The residents are cheerful and welcoming in a way that sets off alarms in the back of the mind trained by survival games to distrust cheerfulness. The unmarked quest that unfolds if you investigate is called Our Little Secret. And the secret, found in a basement, confirmed by examining a refrigerator in a storage area, is that the community of Andale has been sustaining itself through cannibalism. The good food available is human meat. The well-maintained houses are funded by robbing and consuming travelers. The pleasant families are pleasant in the way of people who have decided that what they are doing is normal and see no reason to be defensive about it. The horror here is not in any jump scare or monster encounter. It is in the architecture of normalcy. The developers built a community that looked like what communities are supposed to look like, and then put the reality underneath it and trusted the player to find it. Most players do not investigate carefully enough. They accept the pleasant surface. They leave without ever going down into the basement. Andale's community continues to be pleasant to the surface of things, and the traveler moves on without ever knowing what they ate. Matthie's Animal Husbandry Farm, another unmarked location in Fallout 3, tells a story of a different kind of horror. The farm itself is unremarkable. Animals, barns, the usual post-war agricultural setup. But scattered around the farm are diary entries written by a young boy whose parents went out to scavenge shortly after the bombs fell. They came back, but they were ghouls. The radiation had transformed them in the weeks they had been away, and they returned looking like monsters. The boy, who would have been perhaps 9 or 10 years old based on the writing, did not know what had happened to his parents. He knew only that the people who came back were not the people who had left. He killed them. He buried them by the farm. The gravestones are findable. The later diary entries document his descent into isolation, and then into something that resembles madness. He becomes convinced that the animals on the farm are planning against him. The later entries are increasingly fragmented. The penultimate entry describes elaborate defenses he has constructed against the animals' conspiracy. The final entry is incomprehensible. His body is not in the immediate area. It is not clear what happened to him. The story simply ends in the way that stories often end in the Fallout world, without resolution, without closure, with only the evidence of what came before. The farm sits quietly in the capital wasteland, tended by no one, with 2 small gravestones that mark where a child buried something he could not name. The lore of Vault 11 in Fallout New Vegas is perhaps the most formally sophisticated piece of storytelling in the series. The Vault's experiment was this. Residents were informed that one sacrifice must be chosen every year, or everyone would die. The social mechanisms that would determine how those sacrifices were chosen were left entirely up to the residents. What followed, documented in the Vault's terminal entries and environmental details over the course of decades, is a study in how political institutions arise from existential necessity and then develop their own inertia. In the early years, the sacrifice was chosen by lot, then by election of an overseer who would serve and then be sacrificed at the end of their term. Then the elections became political. Factions formed. Alliance structures emerged. People maneuvered to ensure that someone else would be chosen. The political culture of Vault 11, as it appears in the terminal entries, mirrors the worst of what happens when people with too much to lose gain control of institutions. The final act of the Vault story is devastating. 5 residents, in the end, refused the sacrifice system. They decided that everyone would die rather than continue. The Vault's computer informed them that they had passed the test and were free to leave. 4 of the 5 immediately took their own lives from accumulated guilt for the deaths they had either caused or failed to prevent. The 5th walked out. You walk in, as the player, long after all of this. The terminal entries are still there. The political posters are still on the walls. The architecture of the final voting system is legible in the layout of the Vault's common areas. And the small memorial in the deepest room, placed there by the survivor who left alone, is the only acknowledgement from inside the story that any of it happened. The fate of Harold is one of the oldest running threads in Fallout lore. Harold appeared in the original Fallout as a friendly mutant NPC who had a small tree growing out of his head, which he referred to as Bob. He appeared again in Fallout 2, older, Bob somewhat larger. In Fallout 3, Harold appears in a location far to the east of the capital wasteland, and Bob has now grown enormous, a full ancient-looking tree, and Harold has become the center of a small community of people who worship him as a nature deity. The quest associated with Harold asks whether you should accelerate his spore growth, kill him painlessly, or leave him alone. Each option has different implications for the surrounding ecology, but what runs through all of them is Harold's own perspective on his situation, which has shifted over the decades from cheerful resilience to something more ambiguous. He has been alive longer than most people survive in the wasteland. He has watched companions and communities come and go. He is no longer entirely sure whether his existence has been fortunate or not. The Fallout 3 treatment of Harold represents a kind of honest reckoning with what it would actually mean to live through the apocalypse for that long. It is not triumphant, it is not inspiring, it is simply the portrait of a person who has outlasted their context, who has become something else's story rather than their own, and who has to decide what to do about that. The game gives you the option to give him peace. Some players do, some do not. The choice is one of the more philosophically serious ones in the franchise. The Children of Adam are a religious group that appears in several Fallout games, most extensively in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC. They worship radiation itself, specifically the form of radiation emitted by nuclear weapons, as a divine force. In-universe, they interpret the Great War as a holy event, a divine cleansing that unmade the old world to make way for something new, and they regard their own radiation exposure not as contamination but as sacrament. The lore of the Children of Adam is often treated as straightforward cultish weirdness, but if you read their sermons, their holotapes, their internal texts carefully, there is a more interesting theological tradition underneath the surface. Their understanding of radiation as a force of both destruction and creation is connected to real ideas about atomic physics. The same nuclear reactions that destroy also power stars also are at the origin of the elements heavier than hydrogen. Their theology is wrong about who is listening to their prayers, but the metaphysical structure of what they believe is more coherent than it first appears. This is, again, one of the signs of careful writing. The Children of Adam are not written as stupid people who believe stupid things. They are written as sincere people who have built a meaningful cosmology out of the most devastating experience their world has ever had. Understanding them requires reading more of their material than most players do. Most players just shoot them. One of the smallest and most beautiful pieces of hidden lore in all of Fallout is a holotape in Fallout 4 called Evan's Home Movies. You find it in an unremarkable location, in the belongings of someone who is long dead, and when you play it, you hear what it sounds like: a home video, children arguing about who gets to hold the camera, an adult voice asking everyone to smile. The sounds of a family doing ordinary things before any of this happened. The content of the tape is not plot relevant. It does not advance any quest. There is nothing in it that changes the game in any mechanical way. Someone wrote that script and recorded it anyway, because they thought it mattered to have one piece of evidence in the game of what was actually lost. Not civilization in the abstract, not technology, not history. A family video, children's voices, the specific, irreplaceable texture of an ordinary afternoon. If you have found this tape in the game and sat with it for a moment, you know what it does to a person who is paying attention. And the fact that it is there, hidden in the ruins of someone's belongings, unrequired, unrewarded, placed with the same care as any major story beat, says something important about the people who make these games. Section 5. What your companions know. The companions in the Fallout games, the characters who walk alongside you through the wasteland, are among the franchise's most carefully constructed elements. In the 3D-era games, companions have complex systems of reaction and preference, liking certain actions, disliking others, offering commentary on the world as you move through it. Most of that commentary is noticed only in passing. But hidden within the companion systems of Fallout 4 in particular are layers of storytelling that the surface gameplay barely hints at. Nick Valentine is a synth detective who operates out of Diamond City. His backstory involves a pre-war police detective named Nick Valentine whose memories were uploaded into a Generation 1 synth body, making him something more than a robot and something other than the original human. This premise raises questions that the game handles with considerable delicacy, but less noticed than Nick's main questline, which eventually takes you to the island of Far Harbor where some of the most interesting synth-related questions in the game are explored, are his ambient dialogue lines. Nick comments on the landscape as you traverse it. He makes observations about buildings, about the people you meet, about the nature of what you are doing at any given moment. And woven through these observations, if you listen carefully over many hours of gameplay, is something that reads like a journal of the decades he has spent in the Commonwealth. Nick has been in Boston for a long time. He has seen things. His comments about certain buildings are more specific than the generic NPC commentary about general post-war conditions. He will sometimes say something about a place that implies he was there before you arrived, that he has a history with this location, that the wasteland you are seeing for the first time is a place he has been navigating through for years. These observations are not flagged as significant. They do not trigger quest markers. They are just Nick talking, in the way that someone who has been alone for a long time sometimes talks when they finally have company, revealing history and fragments that were never intended as revelations. Deacon is a railroad operative who has the ability and habit of disguising himself, changing his appearance, apparently doing so frequently and so thoroughly that his actual history is unclear even to himself. His backstory, when he shares it, involves a pre-war wife, a terrible act of violence, and a life of service to the railroad as a kind of penance. But Deacon is not a reliable narrator. He admits this. He lies as a survival mechanism, and the question of what he lies about versus what he tells the truth about is never fully resolved. There is a piece of environmental detail in the game that suggests Deacon has been watching the player character for longer than the game explicitly states. He appears in photographs from before the game's events begin, photos that can be found in various locations across the Commonwealth if you are looking. These cameos were placed deliberately, suggesting that Deacon was already interested in the sole survivor before the events of the game began. If you put together the timeline implied by these photographs and by what Deacon says about his own past, the picture that emerges is of a person who has organized his entire life around a very specific kind of guilt-driven purpose and who latched onto the sole survivor not just as a railroad asset but as a particular kind of proxy for something he is still working out. His attachment to you, across the entire game, reads differently once you notice the photographs. McCready's real name is Robert Joseph McCready, and longtime Fallout fans will recognize him as the child mayor of Little Lamplight from Fallout 3. In that game, he was a foul-mouthed 12-year-old who ran a community of children outside the capital wasteland. In Fallout 4, he is an adult mercenary working in the Commonwealth, and the distance between who he was and who he has become is the central tension of his character. What is easy to miss is that McCready's dialogue in Fallout 4 contains several references that only make sense if you played Fallout 3 and know his history. Comments about having been in positions of responsibility young. Observations about loyalty that are colored by his time running a community of children who had no one else. The word goober that he uses as a profanity, which was his go-to euphemism in Fallout 3 when he was 12 and could not bring himself to use the actual profanity. The callback is written carefully enough that it rewards the player who knows the original game without alienating the player who does not. McCready is a complete character whether you have Fallout 3 history or not. But for the player who has that history, he is also a portrait of someone who grew up hard and became something specific in response, and the details that connect him to his younger self are embedded in his speech patterns rather than his plot. Curie is a French-accented medical robot. a Mr. Handy unit who spent over 200 years sealed in a laboratory section of Vault 81, developing and testing medical cures on behalf of a program that was not, in the end, what anyone had intended it to be. She has been alone for most of her existence. Her experience of other beings is limited to the patients she has treated and the occasional researcher. What she has been doing in that vault for 2 centuries is science. Real science, in the sense of having a methodology and testing hypotheses and documenting results and updating her models based on evidence. She did not know the world outside was gone. She did not know her work was isolated from the broader human medical community. She did what she was designed to do with complete seriousness for 200 years in a vault. When she joins you as a companion, her observations about the Commonwealth are among the most quietly remarkable dialogue in the game. She has 2 centuries of medical knowledge but no lived experience of anything except a sealed environment. The wasteland is genuinely astonishing to her. Not frightening, not alien, but astonishing. Her curiosity is genuine and her enthusiasm is unguarded in a way that most post-war humans have learned to suppress as a survival mechanism. The writers made a choice with Curie that is worth admiring. They could have played her naivety for comedy. They did, sometimes, and it is funny. But they also allowed her observations to be genuinely insightful, because a being who has spent 200 years observing and studying might actually have perspectives worth taking seriously. The jokes land harder because the underlying character is not a joke. Hancock's full name is John McDonough, and he is the ghoul mayor of Goodneighbor who gave himself the name of a Revolutionary-era Massachusetts governor as a kind of personal mythology. He was born into Diamond City, the younger brother of the city's eventual mayor, and left before his brother consolidated power. He ended up in Goodneighbor, became a ghoul through chem use, and eventually led a revolution against the previous leadership. The details of that revolution are not fully spelled out in the main game, but Hancock's dialogue, across many hours of companionship, pieces it together. He describes what Goodneighbor was like before. He describes what changed. He is careful about how he talks about the violence of the transition, which suggests he has thought about it a great deal and has not fully made his peace with it. One of the companion interactions that players frequently do not hear, because it requires bringing Hancock to a specific location and having reached sufficient affinity with him first, is a conversation that takes place if you visit his old apartment in Goodneighbor at a specific point in his companion questline. He talks about who he used to be before the chems changed his physiology, before the revolution, before he became the story he has been telling everyone ever since. The conversation is brief. He does not linger on it, but it is the closest he comes, in the entire game, to showing you the person underneath the persona. Most players never hear it. Strong is a super mutant who has decided that humanity has something he does not, something called the milk of human kindness, which he has determined to find and then consume or otherwise obtain. He joined the players' group as a companion based on the theory that a human would be able to locate this substance. He never finds it. The game never explicitly clarifies that the milk of human kindness is a Shakespeare quote from Macbeth, describing a quality of compassion and gentleness rather than a literal material. Strong may or may not know the origin of the phrase. His interpretation of what he is looking for is earnest and wrong in a way that is both funny and melancholy. What the writers did with Strong is unusual. They took the super mutant, a Fallout franchise staple who has historically been a straightforward threat or a straightforward comedy option, and gave him a quest. Not a violent quest, an aspirational quest. Strong is looking for something he cannot name properly, something he has only heard described in a cultural artifact he found, and he is moving through the world searching for it with the same intensity that other characters bring to personal vengeance or political ideology. The earnestness of the quest is the joke, but the fact that he is earnest about it at all is something else, something that makes the joke cost more. Strong's affinity dialogue, heard at maximum companion affinity, contains his closest approach to an explanation of why this particular aspiration matters to him. He describes, in the limited vocabulary of a super mutant, something that sounds very much like the experience of loneliness. He found words for something he did not understand. He is looking for what those words are supposed to describe. He never finds it. You might argue that the game gives it to him anyway, in the form of the friendship with the sole survivor that his affinity system implies. He would disagree. Strong does not deal in implications. The companion conversation system in Fallout 4 also includes a deeply hidden layer, the conversations companions have with each other when you swap one for another. When you tell Piper she can go home to Diamond City and pick up McCready from Takahashi's, the two exchange words in the transition. These conversations are brief, but they are written with the same care as the main companion dialogue, and they reveal cross-character relationships that are not established anywhere in the main narrative. Nick Valentine and Hancock have a specific quality to their relationship, built in the few lines of their transition conversations that implies a long and complex pre-existing history. They clearly know each other. The tone of what they say is not the tone of acquaintances. There is a mutual understanding in their shorthand that goes back somewhere, and the game does not explain where. Their friendship or alliance, or whatever it is, precedes the player's arrival in the story, and the transition dialogue is the only place you catch a glimpse of it. Reading through all the companion swap dialogue lines, which fans have compiled into long documents online, is the experience of gradually reconstructing the social world of the Commonwealth from a set of fragments. These characters knew each other before you arrived. Some of them trusted each other. Some of them had complicated histories. The player's arrival collapsed the Commonwealth's existing social geometry into something new, and the swap dialogue is evidence of the geometry that existed before. Section 6. Accidents that became canon. The Fallout series, like all large video game franchises, has a body of lore and gameplay that includes things that happened by accident and were subsequently adopted as features. These moments, where something broke in an interesting way and the developers decided to keep it, are among the most interesting stories in the series' history. They also represent a kind of honesty about game development that is rarely acknowledged. The finished product is never fully the result of intention. Sometimes the best things in a game arrive sideways. In the early development of Fallout New Vegas, the game's prop team built structures for a specific reason and then discovered those structures had an unintended consequence that improved the game. The waterfront villages of the Mojave, where settlements are partially built over bodies of water on wooden plank walkways and docks, arose from a glitch in Obsidian's terrain validation system. When a check that was supposed to prevent structures from spawning on unsuitable terrain was accidentally removed during a code optimization pass, settlements began generating partially in water, connected to shore by improvised wooden walkways. Rather than restoring the check and correcting the placement, the designers looked at the results and decided the accidental geometry was better than the intended geometry. The waterfront settlements were more visually interesting, more evocative of human ingenuity in the face of impractical circumstances. They kept the accidental placements and built out the art direction to support them. The wooden walkways became canonical. The settlements became some of the more visually memorable locations in the Mojave. This is the Fallout version of a story that appears throughout game development history. The bug that became a feature because it was better than what the designers had planned. The crawl mechanic in Fallout 4 is a clean example of an accidental behavior that was formalized into a feature. When designer Henrik Kannelberg was implementing the crawl behavior, the intended trigger was pistons. If a piston pushed a block onto your head, you would be forced to crouch into a crawl. That mechanic worked as designed, but players discovered almost immediately that there was a second trigger. Placing a trapdoor above your head and flipping it down achieved the same effect without any pistons or redstone equivalent. The development team could have removed this alternative trigger. Instead, they looked at it, decided it was intuitive, and expanded the usefulness of crawling as a mechanic and allowed it to remain. Kannelberg's own notes on the decision indicate that the accidental trigger was actually more accessible than the intended one, and accessibility was a value the team was interested in. Today, the trapdoor crawl is used in Fallout-adjacent games modding communities as a design principle. An accident became a doctrine. One of the more dramatic accidental feature stories in Fallout involves the town of Covenant in the Commonwealth. Covenant is a settlement that appears unusually clean, unusually safe, unusually pleasant. The residents are welcoming. There is a gate with a simple quiz to get in, which the game presents as a security measure. The intended design of Covenant, when you scratch the surface, is a horror story about a community that has decided to handle the Institute threat by testing every visitor for signs of being a synth and imprisoning and experimenting on anyone who tests positive. The safe test, which is what the gate quiz turns out to be, is not a real security measure. It is a psychological screening tool. But here's what happened during development. Players discovered that you could enter Covenant without taking the safe test through a specific route that bypassed the gate. This was not intended. The designers had assumed all players would take the test, which would color their first impression of the community. Players who bypassed the gate arrived in Covenant without the context that the test provides, and experienced the community's pleasantness as pure rather than as sinister pleasantness. When this was discovered, the designers discussed whether to close the bypass. They did not. Instead, they noted that the bypass created an interesting variant playthrough of Covenant's questline. A player who arrived without the test's framing would experience the horror of the community's reality more purely because they would not have the test's subtle warning in their memory. The alternate entry became an alternate experience of the quest. The Deathclaw's design across the Fallout games has evolved in ways that were not all intentional. In the original games, Deathclaws were essentially large feral predators with the visual grammar of a monster movie creature. Big, clawed, fast, dangerous. In Fallout New Vegas, there is a specific encounter in the Quarry Junction area where the game places an extremely large number of Deathclaws in a single location, creating what became known as one of the most dangerous areas in the franchise for low-level players. This placement was intended to discourage players from taking a specific road too early, steering them toward the main quest path. But the density of Deathclaws in that area created an emergent behavior that the designers had not fully anticipated. High-level players began seeking out the quarry as a challenge run, a kind of arena test against an overwhelming force. The location became a proving ground. The designers, observing this in playtesting and post-launch, made a design note that has apparently influenced how Fallout games since have designed their hardest optional encounters. The lesson was that players will seek difficulty if you offer them a sufficient density of dangerous enemies in a contained space. Give players a wall of danger, and the most experienced players will run at the wall. This has led to the deliberate placement of extremely difficult optional encounters in subsequent Fallout titles, placed to reward the player who goes looking for something the game does not tell them they should go looking for. The radio in Fallout is one of those design elements that functions so well, most players never think about it at all. You turn on your Pip-Boy, pick a station, and music plays as you wander. It sounds simple, but the selection of music for the Fallout radio stations, particularly Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 and Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4, was an extremely deliberate creative decision with complex licensing requirements and a specific emotional logic. The songs on these radio stations are all from the 1940s and 50s. They are predominantly from the American pop and jazz tradition of that era. The tonal quality of the songs, happy and hopeful and bouncy, is in direct counterpoint to the devastation of the world. Walking through ruins while Billie Holiday sings about being someone's sunshine is either darkly funny or genuinely moving depending on your mood, and the Fallout games have consistently used that tonal dissonance as their primary emotional register. What is less known is that several songs that were in the game during development were removed because the licensing costs were prohibitive. There were songs the developers loved and wanted in the game that never made it because the rights holders wanted too much money, or the rights were too complicated to navigate. The radio we hear in the finished games is the radio as filtered through what was actually affordable, and the stations that emerged from that filtering are different from what the developers had originally imagined. In some cases, the songs that were cut were replaced with songs that ended up working better for the game's atmosphere than the intended choices. This is another accidental improvement. The licensing limitations forced creative decisions that the budget did not allow for flexibility on, and the constraints produced something more interesting than total freedom might have. One of the most quietly remarkable accidental features in Fallout 4 is the behavior of Preston Garvey, the settlement quest NPC whose tendency to assign repeated quests became one of the game's most discussed design elements. What is less known is that this behavior was a technical accident before it became a design choice. In early internal builds of the game, Preston's quest assignment system had a loop that did not have a proper termination condition in certain edge cases. This meant that under specific circumstances, his quest assignments would cycle without end. The QA team flagged this. The lead designers looked at it and made an unusual call. They did not fix the loop because they felt it accurately modeled the reality of managing an expanding network of settlements that constantly needed attention. The decision was controversial internally. Some team members felt it was simply a bug that they had talked themselves into keeping. Others felt it was the first accurate simulation of what community management would actually feel like. The finished game kept the behavior, framed it as Preston's enthusiasm for helping people, and shipped it. What followed was years of players complaining about Preston and years of designers defending the decision on the grounds that the game about building a community should make you feel what building a community feels like. Endless, necessary, never quite done. Whether this is brilliant or frustrating probably says something about how you feel about community management as a concept. Section 7. Settlement Secrets. The settlements of the Fallout universe, the towns and outposts and camps that people have carved out of the ruins, are among the most carefully constructed elements in the franchise's world building. Many of them look improvised. All of them were designed. And the stories buried in them, in their architecture and their populations and their histories, are among the richest in the series. Rivet City, the aircraft carrier settlement in Fallout 3, is one of the most structurally interesting locations in the franchise. An actual decommissioned carrier that ran aground, now serving as the largest and arguably most stable community in the capital wasteland. It has a functioning market, a functioning government, a science lab, a bar. The social complexity of Rivet City is unusual for a Fallout 3 settlement in that it has real factions, real internal politics, real class divisions between the people who live in the nicer parts of the ship and the people who live in the worst parts. But hidden in Rivet City's history is a schism that the game references but never fully dramatizes. At some point in the city's past, there was a major political dispute that ended with a group of residents leaving to found their own settlement. That settlement was Canterbury Commons. The dispute, reconstructed from terminal entries and dialogue fragments, was essentially about governance. Whether Rivet City should maintain its current leadership structure or whether it should move towards something more democratic. The people who left lost the argument. Canterbury Commons is a smaller, poorer, more precarious settlement than Rivet City. The people who stayed won and maintained a system that, while more stable in some ways, has produced the wealth inequalities visible in the ship's class geography. This is Fallout 3 doing actual political commentary through environmental design, creating two communities whose existence in relation to each other tells a story about political philosophy and its consequences that you have to reconstruct yourself from fragments. Diamond City in Fallout 4 has a wall. The whole city has a great green wall made from the remaining sections of Fenway Park's outfield wall, and inside that wall the city's class divisions are physically mapped onto the geography. The wealthiest residents live in the upper stands, converted bleacher sections that are genuinely elevated above the rest of the city. The poorest residents live in public occurrences, the newspapers section of the market, or in the slums that exist in the market area below. The wall itself tells a story. It was built after the Great War by the city's founders, and it was built specifically to keep ghouls out. This founding trauma of the anti-ghoul wall has shaped Diamond City's culture in ways that are visible throughout the game. The mayor, McDonough, built his political career on anti-ghoul sentiment. Piper's newspaper has been investigating his corruption for years. The residents who are ghouls, or who sympathize with ghouls, exist in a fraught relationship with the city's official culture. If you read all of Piper's newspapers, all of the wall's historical graffiti, all of the old terminal entries in the locked rooms of the upper stands, you get a political history of Diamond City that is more detailed than most cities in post-apocalyptic fiction. The history of who built the wall, who benefited from it, who was hurt by it, and who is using the memory of it now for political purposes is all there, in fragments, waiting to be assembled. Good Neighbor in Fallout 4 is the Commonwealth's designated haven for people who cannot or will not comply with Diamond City's norms. Ghouls are welcome in Good Neighbor. People whose habits or histories would make them unwelcome in the larger settlement have a place in Good Neighbor. It is explicitly a community defined by the absence of exclusion, and that absence of exclusion is its founding principle. What the game reveals slowly, through Hancock's dialogue and through the environmental detail of the neighborhood itself, is that Good Neighbor's tolerance was not achieved without violence. The previous leadership of Good Neighbor was overthrown in a revolution that Hancock led, and the revolution was bloody. The residents who benefited from the old regime's exclusionary policies did not leave peacefully. Good Neighbor's tolerance was built on the kind of confrontation that the political philosophy of tolerance often tries to avoid thinking too hard about. This is not a critique of Good Neighbor in the game's framing. Hancock is presented sympathetically. The community he created is genuinely more equitable than Diamond City. But the history of how it was created is present for anyone who looks, and it adds a layer of complexity to what might otherwise be a straightforwardly good settlement versus bad settlement dynamic. The town of Megaton in Fallout 3 is built around a nuclear bomb. Literally, the settlement was constructed around an unexploded nuclear weapon that fell during the war, and the residents have built their culture around it. The bomb has been made into a shrine. The children of Adam have a presence there. There is a settler who has spent years trying to disarm it, and another who will pay you to detonate it. The existence of the bomb in the center of the town is easy to read as pure video game absurdism. Of course, there's a bomb in the middle of the town. But if you read the terminal entries and the historical logs in Megaton, you find a more considered portrait of how a community negotiates with an existential threat it cannot remove. The bomb is too heavy to move. The radiation it emits has become part of the local ecology, supporting certain plant and insect life. The children of Adam have attached religious significance to it that has become part of the community's cultural identity. Disarming it, for the residents who have tried, has proven beyond their technical capacity. So Megaton has built itself around the thing it cannot solve, incorporated the unsolvable into its mythology, and decided to live with it. This is either a story about human adaptability or a story about willful self-delusion depending on how you look at it. Fallout does not tell you which. It just shows you the bomb and the town and lets you decide. Far Harbor, the island DLC for Fallout 4, contains a settlement called Acadia that is home almost exclusively to synths. Specifically to synths who have escaped from the Institute and created their own community, hidden in the fog of the island, attempting to live autonomously. The leader of Acadia is Dima, an advanced synth who has been there for a very long time. Dima's history, revealed over the course of the DLC's questline, involves a secret of considerable weight. He has committed an act of violence against the human leadership of a neighboring community and concealed the fact. The DLC asks you to decide what to do with this knowledge, offering options ranging from exposing Dima to concealing the truth to a more complex resolution. But what most players miss is the full extent of Dima's perspective on what he did, available through patient dialogue and through the journals and records that exist in Acadia's archives. Dima does not believe he did the wrong thing. He believes he made a calculated decision about which lives to prioritize in a situation where all options involved harm. His reasoning is coherent, his guilt is genuine. The two coexist in him without resolving, and the player's choices about how to judge him are choices about how to navigate the space where coherent reasoning and genuine harm meet. This is the most philosophically serious question Far Harbor asks, and it asks it quietly, in the details of an optional archive that most players don't fully explore. The Diamond City Market has a water vendor whose backstory, reconstructible from scattered dialogue and terminal entries, is a tragedy of capitalism in the post-war world. The vendor, Takahashi, is a Protectron robot who serves noodles, and whose entire vocabulary seems to consist of some version of the Japanese phrase for, "Would you like some noodles?" But the market stall he operates was once a human-run business. The human owner is dead. Takahashi has been running the stall in their absence for what appears to have been years, serving noodles because that is what he was programmed to do. His programming's commercial purpose now divorced from any human intention, operating on autonomous continuation in the absence of the human who set him in motion. This is a very small story about a robot who makes noodles. It is also, if you allow it to be, a story about the tragedy of purpose divorced from meaning. Takahashi serves his function perfectly, and that function no longer serves anyone who intended it. He continues because stopping is not in his programming. There is probably a word for this feeling that is not English. Section 8. Weapons with histories. The weapons of Fallout are not props. The best of them are artifacts. Objects that carry the weight of the world they came from and arrived in your hands with histories already attached. Learning to read those histories is one of the quiet pleasures of the franchise. The Fat Man is a portable nuclear catapult, a shoulder-mounted weapon that fires mini-nukes. It is ridiculous. It is also a reference to the name given to one of the atomic bombs used in World War II, the one dropped on Nagasaki. Calling the weapon the Fat Man and making it available for casual use in a game set in the ruins of a nuclear apocalypse is the kind of dark joke that is easy to miss precisely because it is so direct. The mini-nukes it fires are, of course, nuclear weapons, and the fact that they are called mini is another joke. A reference to the way the nuclear arms race produced a proliferation of tactical nuclear weapons that were marketed as smaller and more usable than strategic weapons, with the underlying logic that smaller nuclear weapons were somehow qualitatively different from large ones. The Fat Man and its ammo are a walking, portable critique of nuclear weapons normalization, and you use them to blow up Deathclaws. The Deliverer is a pistol given to you by the Railroad in Fallout 4 with a history attached. It is a modified 10mm pistol designed by the Railroad specifically for infiltration work. Quieter than a standard weapon, smaller, easier to conceal. The weapon itself is unremarkable visually, but the name, and the context in which you receive it, suggests a weight. The Railroad has been using the Deliverer for a long time. It has passed through multiple handlers. Each of them received it as you do, as a tool and as a trust. The line of possession represented by the weapon, the chain of people who carried it and used it and passed it on, is not spelled out anywhere in the game. But Deacon, who gives it to you, speaks about it as though it has a history worth respecting. The fact that he calls it the Deliverer, rather than leaving it as a modified pistol, is the gesture toward that history. That gun from Fallout New Vegas, as mentioned earlier, is a direct callback to the original Fallout's iconic 223 pistol. But the name is doing something more specific than nostalgia. That gun is the way you refer to something that is so singular in its category that it needs no other description. The 223 pistol in the original Fallout was memorable enough that players who experienced it know exactly which gun it is, which means the name is a kind of secret handshake. Only the player who has been here before, who knows the reference, understands what they are holding. For the player who does not know Fallout's history, it is just a distinctive revolver with an interesting design. For the player who does, it is the emotional equivalent of running into someone from your past in a place you did not expect. The sudden, surprising weight of continuity. Lincoln's repeater in Fallout 3 is a unique rifle hidden in the Museum of History, specifically in an area that is very easy to miss on the way through the museum's multiple levels. It is a Henry repeating rifle, and the game presents it as having been Abraham Lincoln's personal firearm, preserved in the museum and now available for scavenging in the ruins of post-war Washington. The historical Lincoln did not have a famous personal repeating rifle. This is a fictionalization. But the reason the game puts it there, in the museum that was dedicated to American history, in the section that had been devoted to Lincoln's legacy before the bombs fell, is to ask a particular question about the preservation of historical artifacts in a world where history has effectively ended. In the game's pre-war world, Lincoln's repeater was an object of tremendous cultural significance, preserved and displayed and interpreted through the lens of a national mythology. In the post-war world, it is a gun, a good gun. A gun that you might carry for the rest of the game because it is effective. The question of what happens to the meaning of historical artifacts when the civilization that assigned meaning to them is gone is posed without being stated, and the player answers it by picking up the rifle or leaving it on the floor. The junk jet in Fallout 4 is a weapon that fires literally any item in your inventory as a projectile. You can load it with teddy bears and shoot them at enemies. You can load it with lunchboxes. You can load it with desk fans and make an enemy's death scene involve a spinning desk fan to the chest. This is a comedy weapon, but it is also, in a way, a profound statement about the economy of the wasteland. Every item in the wasteland has potential value as a resource, and what the junk jet does is express, in a direct way, the post-apocalyptic principle that everything is a tool if you are creative enough with it. The same piece of scrap that you have been collecting to build a settlement fence can also be launched at a raider's head at 300 meters per second. The distinction between item categories, between resource and weapon, between building material and ammunition, is a pre-war distinction. The junk jet does not recognize it. The shish kebab, a sword made from motorcycle parts and a flamethrower component, assembled from scrap that no one needs individually but which, combined, produces a flaming blade, is one of the most eloquent weapon designs in the franchise. It has been in the series since Fallout 3, and its endurance speaks to something real about how players interact with handmade weapons in these games. A flaming sword made from a motorcycle part is absurd. It is also beautiful in the way that functional improvisation is always beautiful. It works. It works in exactly the way that something thrown together from available materials always works. Imperfectly, inefficiently, with rough edges and an undeniable character. The shish kebab is not the best weapon in any Fallout game, but it is always the weapon that feels most like the world. One of the least discussed unique weapons in Fallout New Vegas is the Lucky, a unique .357 Magnum revolver that has a higher critical hit chance than standard versions of the gun. The name is straightforward, but the lore behind the weapon, reconstructible from contextual clues around where it is found and who left it there, implies a history. It was hidden in a cash register in a Goodspring store, which is where your adventure begins. The implication is that someone left it there for safekeeping, or lost it there in the chaos of the early game's events, and it remained hidden until you found it. Who left it? The game never says. The serial number and the custom engravings on the weapon suggest a previous owner with specific aesthetic preferences and possibly professional connections to the gambling culture of the strip. But the full history is unwritten. The Lucky exists as an artifact from a story that was never told, which is exactly what the best lore items in Fallout do. They point at something they do not explain. The mysterious strangers. 44 is not a collectible item in the Fallout games, but rather an observed detail that fans have documented through slow-motion footage. When the mysterious stranger appears in VATS in Fallout New Vegas and 4, his revolver has visible engravings if you catch the right frame rate. The engravings are not random decorative patterns. They appear to spell something, though the font and detail are not clear enough at normal play speed to read. This has been the subject of extended community investigation, enhanced video capture, frame analysis, image upscaling applied to screenshots. The current consensus is that the engravings include a number and possibly initials, which has led to extensive theorizing about what those initials represent. Whether this is a developer signature hidden in a prop that is never meant to be fully visible, or a deliberate part of the mysterious stranger's lore, or simply a texture detail that has no intended meaning, nobody has confirmed. But someone put those engravings there. Someone modeled that weapon with that level of detail. In a normal playthrough, the weapon appears for approximately 1 second before the mysterious stranger dissolves back into narrative convenience. Someone spent time on details that were almost certainly never going to be seen clearly by any player during ordinary play. They did it anyway. Section 9. What the factions are hiding. The factions of Fallout, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, the Institute, the Railroad, Caesar's Legion, the New California Republic, represent the political landscape of the post-war world. Most players choose a faction, work with it, and come to understand its ideology through that alignment. But each faction has secrets that its own members are not always aware of, and those secrets are buried in the game's archives. The Brotherhood of Steel was founded by a man named Roger Maxson, a captain in the United States Army who was stationed at Mariposa military base before the war. What he found there changed him. The base was conducting experiments using the forced evolutionary virus, the same virus that would eventually produce the super mutants. The experiments were conducted on unwilling human subjects. Maxson's superior, confronted with the evidence, suffered a mental breakdown. Maxson interrogated the lead scientist, who told him everything. The scientist was later executed. Maxson then did something remarkable for a soldier. He went to his commanding officer, declared himself in rebellion, and hunkered down at the base, gathering the soldiers who would follow him. He transmitted a message in the final hours before the bombs fell, explaining his rebellion, explaining what he had found. When the bombs fell, the message became irrelevant, because there was no longer a government to receive it. But the Brotherhood, the organization he founded, preserved his story. The interesting historical detail buried in the Brotherhood's lore is this. The Brotherhood's founding principles, its insistence on controlling technology, its suspicion of outsiders, its hierarchical structure, are all direct responses to what Maxson found in Mariposa. He built an organization designed to prevent another FEV from happening, to ensure that the technology that caused that horror would be controlled by people he trusted. Every subsequent development in the Brotherhood's history, from its expansion to the East Coast to its conflicts with the NCR to its fractures in New Vegas, flows from that founding trauma. The Brotherhood is not arbitrary in its ideology. It is a response to a specific horror that its founders experienced, and the ideology hardened as the people who remembered the horror were replaced by people who only knew the ideology. This is one of the most realistic and most tragic arcs in the franchise's lore. The Enclave presents itself as the legitimate government of the United States, the successor to the pre-war federal administration, the rightful authority over a recovering nation. This is the core of its ideology and the basis for its aggression. In Fallout 3, where the Enclave appears as the game's main antagonist, the question of whether this claim has any validity is never fully answered. But the environmental details of the Raven Rock facility tell you a great deal about who these people actually are. The Enclave leadership in Fallout 3 is not composed of the best of the pre-war government. It is composed of the people who survived, who had access to the bunkers, who were connected enough or lucky enough to be in the right places. The ideology of Enclave purity, the belief that the Enclave represents humanity's uncorrupted genetic legacy, is in practice the ideology of the privileged survivors of a catastrophe they helped cause, dressing their survival in the language of destiny. The terminal entries in Raven Rock document internal disagreements that the Enclave has had about its own identity. There were people within the organization who questioned whether the purity doctrine was scientifically coherent. There were political factions that believed the Enclave should begin collaborating with the surviving wasteland populations rather than viewing them as contaminated subhumans. Those arguments were lost, and the people who lost them are documented in the archived personnel files as having been reassigned to positions that, reading between the lines, appear to have been forms of internal exile. The Institute in Fallout 4 is the game's most ambiguous faction. It is building synths, it is replacing people with synths, and conducting research it regards as essential for the long-term survival of humanity. Its scientists are, with some exceptions, sincere in their belief that what they are doing is necessary and that the moral costs are justified by the eventual benefit. The hidden history of the Institute, reconstructible from the terminal entries in its deeper sections, is a story of institutional drift. The founders of the Institute had different priorities than the current leadership. Early Institute records show a broader research mandate and a more modest approach to synth development. The shift toward the current program, which produces synths capable of perfectly mimicking humans and deploys them into the wasteland for undisclosed purposes, happened gradually over decades, driven by a small group of researchers whose particular vision of the Institute's future won out over competing visions. The current director inherited an organization whose direction had been set by decisions made before his tenure. He operates within those decisions more than he questions them, and his discomfort with some of what the Institute does is occasionally visible in his dialogue if you pursue specific conversation paths. The tragedy of the Institute is not that it is led by evil people. It is that it is led by people who are implementing a plan they did not fully choose, in an organization they did not fully build, and who have accumulated enough investment in the institution's continuation that questioning it in any fundamental way feels like betraying everything they have given their lives to. Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas is the faction that most players, particularly players who align with the NCR or play morally good characters, simply dismiss as evil without engaging with its ideology. This is understandable. The Legion practices slavery, treats women as property, executes those who defy it, and has implemented a system of tribal conquest that is genuinely horrifying in its execution. But the hidden dimension of the Legion's ideology, available in conversations with Caesar himself and in the books and terminal entries that populate his camp, is that Caesar is a sincere student of political history and sociology. He read Hegel. He believes he has constructed a synthesis of historical models of civilization building that is more capable of producing long-term stability than the NCR's essentially reconstructionist approach. He is wrong, probably, and his ends do not justify his means, certainly, but he is not simply a cruel man who enjoys cruelty. What the game does with Caesar, and what most players miss by simply fighting through his camp rather than talking their way through it, is present a genuinely intelligent person who has used their intelligence in the service of something monstrous. This is more disturbing than a straightforwardly evil villain. The historical tradition Caesar is drawing on is real, and some of it is academically credible, and watching it be deployed in service of a slavery-based empire in the ruins of Nevada is the most uncomfortable ideological conversation the series has ever hosted. The Railroad, the pro-synth underground organization in Fallout 4, is presented in the main game as a clearly sympathetic faction. They protect synths, they give them new identities. They believe synths are people and that treating them as property is wrong. All of this is treated as straightforwardly good. The hidden history of the Railroad, available in its archives and in extended dialogue with senior members, is more complicated. The Railroad has been operating for a long time and has accumulated a significant number of failures, operations that went wrong, synths who were recaptured, agents who died. The organization's response to these failures has gradually produced a leadership culture that is, in some ways, quite ruthless. willing to sacrifice individual operatives for the security of the larger mission, compartmentalizing information to the point where agents cannot fully evaluate what they are being asked to do, treating the philosophical question of synth personhood as settled as to the point where questioning any aspect of railroad doctrine is treated with suspicion. Deacon's behavior, specifically his habit of lying and his deep institutional ambivalence, reads differently once you understand this history. He has been in the railroad long enough to see the gap between what the organization says it is and what it actually does when the decisions are hard. He has not left. He has chosen to stay and be useful while maintaining a kind of private skepticism that he expresses through misdirection. This is not hypocrisy so much as the psychological adaptation of someone who has stayed inside a flawed institution because the alternatives are worse and the mission is still worth something. The new California Republic is the largest functional nation-state in the post-war world as of New Vegas's timeline. Its existence represents the most successful attempt at reconstructing pre-war civilization yet seen in the games. It has a Senate. It has an army. It has trade policy and infrastructure and census records. It is, by most measures, the most conventionally admirable faction in New Vegas. The hidden dimension of the NCR, available in the game's lore and in the experiences of various communities that have had contact with it, is that its conventional admirability is also its conventional fault structure. The NCR bureaucracy has the self-perpetuating qualities of all bureaucracies. It serves itself more than it serves its ostensible purpose. The NCR army in the Mojave is suffering from overextension, supply chain problems, corruption in the officer class, and a political mandate that does not match its military capacity. The NCR soldiers you meet in the Mojave are not villains. Most of them are people who joined the army because the NCR represents something worth joining. But they are also people operating inside an institution that has structural problems that individual good intentions cannot fix. This is the NCR's hidden tragedy, and it is entirely available to the player who reads all the terminals in Camp McCarran and talks to all the soldiers and then sits with the picture those fragments produce. Section 10. Sound, Music, and the Voice of the Wasteland. The audio design of Fallout is one of the least discussed but most essential elements of what makes these games feel the way they do. From the specific crackle of an old radio station to the way gunshots echo differently in open wasteland versus enclosed vaults, every sonic detail was chosen, and many of those choices were made in ways that reveal something about how the games were designed to be experienced. Enon Zur, the composer who has scored every Bethesda-era Fallout game, from Fallout 3 through Fallout 76, describes his approach to the series as an attempt to score a world rather than a story. He has said that the challenge of post-apocalyptic music is the same challenge as post-apocalyptic fiction. How do you convey devastation without making the audience too devastated to continue experiencing it? His solution across all these games has been to root the ambient score in something that is simultaneously desolate and quietly hopeful, using orchestral elements that are stripped of their most triumphant qualities but retain a sense of vastness. The main theme of Fallout 3 uses sparse strings, distant percussion, and a melodic line that sounds like it is searching for something it cannot quite find. This is intentional. Zur wanted the main theme to feel like the lone wanderer's experience of the capital wasteland, alone in a very large place, looking for something, not yet sure if it is findable. The music is the emotional state externalized. What is less discussed is how the music changes. Zur designed the score with a layered system. Ambient exploration music, tension music, and combat music each have different orchestration, but they are all related thematically. Elements of the exploration music appear in the tension music and then in the combat music. This means that the music's transformation as the game's context changes feels organic, rather than like a hard cut between modes. The transition from wandering to danger to combat is scored like a continuous emotional experience, rather than three separate states. This was Zur's explicit design goal, as he has described in interviews about his approach to implementation. The implementation was as important to him as the quality of the compositions themselves. He has said that music in a game, unlike music in a film, has to work without you knowing when it will play or for how long. Every cue has to be able to begin, continue, and end at any moment without sounding wrong. This constraint shaped every piece he composed for the series. The radio stations of the Fallout games were designed to do something specific. to make the player feel the emotional weight of what was lost in the war through the continued existence of cultural artifacts from before the war. The songs are not chosen randomly. They create an emotional texture when experienced over hundreds of hours of play. The Ink Spots, whose music appears in both Fallout 3 and 4, were one of the most distinctive vocal groups of the 1940s. Their sound is characterized by a deep bass voice singing the verse and a high tenor voice singing the harmonies, and it produces an effect that is simultaneously old and intimate. When I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire plays on Galaxy News Radio while you walk through the ruins of Washington, the specific quality of the Ink Spot's sound creates a kind of time dislocation. The music is from a time before the war, it is beautiful, and it is playing over destruction. The song's title has become its own kind of dark joke. Maybe by the same group, which appears in Fallout 3, is about longing for someone who is absent. Played in the context of a game about a character looking for their father in a destroyed city, the song's emotional content aligns with the player's narrative situation in a way that feels almost too precise. This alignment is not an accident. The music supervisors for these games listened to hundreds of songs before selecting the ones that would appear on the radio, and the selections were made based on precisely this kind of emotional and thematic resonance. The ambient sound design of the Fallout games contains hidden layers that most players never consciously register, but that contribute significantly to the emotional atmosphere. In Fallout 3, the ambient sounds of the open capital wasteland include wind, distant debris, and what sounds like very faint, distorted music from somewhere far away. Music that you can never find the source of, and that plays at a frequency below full consciousness, which means you feel it more than you hear it. This design choice was documented in interviews with the game's sound team. They wanted the open wasteland to feel like a place that had been inhabited by music and was now empty of it, where the memory of sound persisted in a distorted form. The ghostly, barely audible ambient music of the capital wasteland was designed to be the sonic equivalent of the ruins. It was not the thing itself, but the impression of the thing left behind. In Fallout 4, the same principle applies, but the execution is different. The ambient sounds of the Commonwealth include industrial processes, the creak of damaged structures, the specific acoustic signature of the ocean in the harbor area. The acoustic design was built around real recordings made in specific physical environments: ruined industrial facilities, collapsed buildings, actual ocean coastline. The game's sound design team recorded in real locations and then processed those recordings to produce the specific textures of the Commonwealth's acoustic environment. One of the most remarkable pieces of incidental sound design in Fallout New Vegas is the ambient soundscape of the Mojave itself. The desert has a specific acoustic character. Sound carries differently in dry air. Wind sounds different through sparse vegetation than through dense forest. The silence of open desert is qualitatively different from the silence of closed spaces. The sound team for New Vegas worked to capture this quality, and the result is an ambient environment that feels like actual desert in a way that most game environments do not. This creates a specific effect when you are in the Mojave at night, navigating between towns in the dark with the radio off. The wasteland sounds like a desert. The specific qualities of the ambient recording create a sense of place, of actually being in a very specific geography. Players who have spent time in actual desert environments sometimes remark on this, that the Mojave wasteland sounds right in a way they did not expect a video game environment to sound. The sound of crickets in the evening of the Mojave is particularly noted in this context, not because crickets are unusual in games, but because the specific frequency mix and density of the cricket sound in New Vegas is calibrated to feel like a real desert night rather than a generic insect ambience. Someone spent time on crickets. Someone recorded actual desert insects and processed those recordings and placed them in the game's audio system, and the result is that the Mojave at night sounds like the Mojave at night. The voice acting in the Fallout games contains its own layer of hidden detail. Ron Perlman's narration of the opening and ending segments of Fallout 1 and 2, and again in New Vegas, is one of the most recognized vocal performances in gaming. His delivery of "War never changes" has become one of the most quoted phrases in game history. But the hidden aspect of this performance is what Perlman has described as his approach to it. He has said in interviews that he delivers the line as if he is genuinely tired. Not dramatically tired, not performatively weary. Actually tired, in the way of someone who has said a true thing so many times that the truth of it has become exhausting rather than illuminating. The specific emotional quality of his delivery is not the emotional quality of revelation, it is the quality of confirmation. War never changes, and this is what it looks like. Again, still, the same as it always was. This emotional quality colors every game that opens with his voice. The exhaustion in war. War never changes, is the exhaustion of history repeating itself, and Perlman found a way to put that exhaustion directly into the delivery rather than into the text. The text is 3 words. The emotional content is the entire franchise. Linda Carter, the actress who played Wonder Woman in the 1970s television series, voiced Magnolia, the singer in the third rail bar in Good Neighbor in Fallout 4. She sings 3 original songs in the game, performed live in the bar as ambient entertainment, and the songs are high-quality original compositions designed to sound like 1940s jazz. The casting of Carter specifically, rather than any other singer who could have provided the same technical performance, is a choice with a specific logic. Carter has an extremely recognizable voice to anyone familiar with her career, and her presence in the game as a jazz singer in a post-apocalyptic bar is a deliberate layering of cultural references. Wonder Woman, the superhero of the pre-war pop culture tradition that the Fallout series nostalgically preserves, is performing in the ruins of that tradition. The actress who embodied one of the most optimistic figures of that tradition is performing songs of longing and loss in a world where the tradition she came from has been annihilated. Most players in Good Neighbor just hear a good singer. The layer beneath that, for the player who recognizes Carter's voice, is the specific melancholy of what she represents doing what she is doing there. Section 11. Geography and Hidden Places. The maps of Fallout are not blank canvases waiting for content to be placed on them. They are arguments. Every geographical choice, the placement of a building, the angle of a road, the proximity of one settlement to another, is a statement about what this world was and what it has become. And hidden within the geography of these games are places that most players never reach, stories told entirely through location rather than through dialogue or quests. The location of the original Fallout is never shown on a map in any subsequent game. The first game takes place in Southern California, and its main locations include Vault 13, the Hub, Necropolis, the Cathedral, and the Master's Lair underground. Players of the original game know these places with the specific familiarity of beloved territory. Players who came to the franchise through Fallout 3 or New Vegas have only the references in those games to guide their understanding. Those references are placed carefully. In Fallout New Vegas, characters mention the Hub as a trading city that still exists in some form. They mention Shady Sands, which became the capital of the new California Republic. The names of the first game's locations persist into later games not as visited places, but as points on a map that you know exists but cannot see. The world of Fallout extends beyond the player's frame at all times, and the deliberate placement of references to unseen places is a way of communicating that the wasteland is bigger than any single game can contain. The area just beyond the borders of Fallout 3's accessible map has been the subject of extensive exploration by players using various methods to bypass the game's boundary systems. What they found was incomplete geometry, terrain that extends for a distance, then becomes flat and textureless, then stops. This is the architecture of a world that was not built to be seen from outside. But in a few specific directions, the boundary geometry suggests that territory was started and then abandoned, rather than never begun. There is a section to the north of the map where additional terrain geometry exists that does not appear in the accessible game. This has led to speculation about what was intended for that area. The most credible theories, based on what can be seen and on design documents that have occasionally surfaced, suggest that the northern area was planned for content related to a specific faction that ended up not having its own quest hub in the final game. Whether this territory would have been an entirely separate location or an extension of an existing area is unclear. The geometry is incomplete enough to be ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that someone built those terrain elements and then left them there, outside the visible world, unreachable under normal circumstances. The Fallout 3 map has a shadow world beyond its edges, unfinished and unplayable, and silently waiting for a development timeline that never extended far enough to include it. The Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 are one of the most deliberately disorienting locations in the game. They are a quarry operated by a mining company, which is the surface-level explanation, but the quarry goes deep, and the deeper you go, the stranger the environmental details become. At the bottom of the Dunwich Borers, accessible only to a player willing to fight through a very large number of enemies, there is a pool of water with specific properties. Things happen near this pool that are not mechanically explained. There are hallucinations. There are sounds that do not have identifiable sources. There are references, in terminal entries and environmental details, to the site having been used by a group involved in practices that the game does not clearly label as religious or occult. The Dunwich connection, as mentioned earlier, is to H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, but the Dunwich Borers take the reference further than the Dunwich building in Fallout 3 did. The quarry goes to a literal depth that suggests something beneath the surface of the world, and the environmental design in the lowest levels of the quarry has the quality of genuinely uncanny. Something wrong that you cannot fully articulate? Something that the game allows to exist without explaining it. The hallucinations triggered in the deepest section show pre-war images, suggesting that the site's history extends to before the bombs fell, and that whatever was happening here was happening before the apocalypse made everything strange. This is Fallout's clearest suggestion that some of the wasteland's weirdness predates the war. The most famous hidden location in New Vegas is the alien crash site, which is technically not hidden because it appears on the map once you have found it, but which most players miss in their first playthroughs because it is far from any road or quest path. What players who find it encounter is a crashed flying saucer and the scattered remains of alien technology, confirming that the Fallout universe does have extraterrestrial life and that some of it has been visiting Earth. This is significant lore. The Mothership Zeta DLC for Fallout 3 confirmed aliens explicitly, but New Vegas's reference is subtler. A crash site with no quest attached, no NPC to explain it, no reward for finding it beyond the alien blaster available nearby. It exists as a fact of the world's geography. Aliens visited the Mojave. Their ship crashed. Nobody built a quest around it because nobody needed to. The fact of it is enough. The ruins of the former Washington Mall in Fallout 3 contain a section that most players explore once and then do not return to. The area around the Lincoln Memorial. The memorial itself is occupied and becomes the center of a quest related to freeing captured, escaped slaves. But the approach to the memorial, through the mall, past the ruins of the other museums and government buildings, is one of the most charged pieces of geography in any game. The Washington Monument still stands. It is damaged, but it stands. The Lincoln Memorial still stands. These were structures built to last, and they did. The fact that the monuments to American ideals survived while the institutions that embodied those ideals did not is a physical argument that the game never makes explicitly, but which is present in the geography for any player who walks, that ground and thinks about what they are seeing. The memorial to the man who ended legal slavery in the United States is, in the Fallout 3 universe, a site associated with people who are still fighting against slavery. The game made this connection deliberately and chose not to editorialize about it beyond placing it there. The Far Harbor Island in Fallout 4's DLC is geographically remarkable for a specific reason. It exists in persistent fog. The fog is not merely aesthetic. It is an active element of the island's ecology, produced by a fog machine of sorts that has been running since before the DLC's events. The fog limits visibility, changes the acoustic character of the environment, affects the behavior of enemies, and contributes to the sense that Far Harbor is a place apart from the mainland, operating by different rules. The geographical effect of this persistent fog is that Far Harbor functions differently as a navigation experience than the mainland Commonwealth. You can get lost in the fog. Landmarks appear and disappear. The experience of moving through the environment is actively impaired in a way that communicates the island's character. Isolated, strange, difficult to read. Players who spend time in Far Harbor often report a specific quality of anxiety that does not attach to most of the mainland's locations. This was a conscious design decision, documented in developer commentary. The team wanted Far Harbor to feel qualitatively different from the Commonwealth, and the fog was their primary architectural tool for achieving that differentiation. The island needed to feel like a place with its own rules, and physically limiting the player's ability to see was the most direct way to enforce that feeling. In Fallout 4's base game, there is a location called the Glowing Sea, a region in the southwest of the map that has the highest concentration of radiation in the Commonwealth. It is barely accessible, almost entirely inhospitable, and the enemies within it are among the most dangerous in the game. Most players visit it once for a specific quest, and then avoid it thereafter. What the glowing sea contains, for the player willing to spend time there with appropriate radiation protection, is a collection of environmental details that build a picture of what that area was before and during the bombs falling. The epicenter of a nuclear strike is there, reconstructible from the geography. The settlements that existed there are identifiable from ruins. Holotapes left by people who were in the area when the bombs fell document the experience of being at ground zero of a nuclear detonation from the perspective of survivors who were not quite close enough to die immediately. These holotapes are among the most disturbing audio recordings in the franchise because they are specific. The experience described is not the abstract experience of nuclear war, but the specific experience of this specific place, these specific people, this specific day. The glowing sea, which most players find repellent and avoid, is actually one of the franchise's most thorough documents of what the Great War actually felt like from the inside. Section 12. The real world behind the wasteland. Every creative work carries the fingerprints of the world in which it was made. Fallout, a series that has been in development across 30 years and has passed through the hands of multiple studios and hundreds of creative professionals, carries an extraordinary density of those fingerprints. Understanding where some of the franchise's choices came from, what real-world histories and anxieties and cultural moments they were responding to, is the last layer of the hidden world we have been exploring tonight. The aesthetic of Fallout's pre-war world, the 1950s Americana gone nuclear, was a deliberate creative decision made by the original developers at Interplay and Black Isle. The first Fallout was released in 1997, and the 1990s had their own complicated relationship with the 1950s. There was a wave of nostalgia for the Eisenhower era at the same time as a countercultural reassessment of that period's darker aspects: the conformism, the racism, the gender roles, the nuclear anxiety that manifested as optimistic propaganda. Fallout took both of those things and put them in conversation. The pre-war world of Fallout is genuinely aspirational in some of its imagery, genuinely terrible in its other aspects, and the game is honest about both without resolving the tension between them. The bomb fell on a world that had Nuka-Cola and white picket fences, and also government-sanctioned human experimentation and institutional racism, and a political culture that would rather end the world than share resources. This is not an academic observation. The specific cultural politics of the 1950s American experience, and the specific ways that experience has been re-examined in subsequent decades, is part of the DNA of the Fallout series. Every cheerful Vault Boy poster is a commentary on a real visual tradition. Every piece of pre-war propaganda in the games is derived from real forms of propaganda that existed and were used for real purposes. The game is a response to history as much as it is an entertainment product. The Fallout universe diverged from our own history at a specific point: the invention of the transistor. In our world, the transistor was developed in 1947 at Bell Labs, and it transformed computing, communication, and electronics over the subsequent decades. In Fallout's universe, the transistor was never invented, and electronics continued to develop along vacuum tube lines. This single technological divergence produced a world that looks simultaneously more advanced in some ways, with nuclear-powered cars and personal robots, and less advanced in others, with computers that use chunky magnetic tape, storage, and communication systems that look like something from the 1950s. This divergence was chosen by the original developers not for technological plausibility but for aesthetic reasons. They wanted a world that felt like what the future looked like in 1950s science fiction, which was a future built on the technology of that era, rather than on technologies that came later. The transistor's absence is not explained in the games in any detail. It is simply assumed. But it produces a world whose internal technological logic is consistent in a way that rewards close attention. The implication of this divergence extends into social history. Many of the social changes that happened in our world between the 1950s and the present were enabled or accelerated by transistor-based technologies: the personal computer, the internet, the mobile phone. In a world without the transistor, those changes may not have happened in the same way or at the same time. The pre-war world of Fallout reflects this. It retained many of the social structures of the 1950s rather than experiencing the cultural disruptions of subsequent decades. One of the most discussed real-world influences on the Fallout series is Stanley Kubrick's 1964 film Dr. Strangelove. The film is a dark comedy about nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction. and its portrait of military and political culture in the nuclear age, absurd, self-defeating, incapable of preventing the catastrophe it is nominally designed to prevent, maps closely onto Fallout's portrait of pre-war government. The specific tropes that Strangelove established, the cheerful bureaucratic language applied to mass destruction, the gap between the strategic logic of deterrence and its practical application, the idea that the people responsible for nuclear weapons are not particularly more competent or rational than anyone else, all of these appear in Fallout's treatment of the pre-war government. The Vault-Tec executives who designed the experiments are not monsters. They are bureaucrats optimizing for efficiency in a system whose ultimate purpose is monstrous. The gap between the banality of the institutional behavior and the horror of the institutional purpose is the same gap that Strangelove was illuminating. The Fallout games never directly reference Strangelove, but the influence is present throughout. It shows up in the tone of pre-war government documents, in the casual language applied to FEV experiments, in the administrative language of Vault-Tec's internal communications. The horror of the pre-war world is bureaucratic horror, and Strangelove was one of the earliest and most effective examinations of that specific kind of horror. The design of the Vault Boy, the cheerful, thumbs-up mascot who appears throughout the Fallout franchise as a design element in everything from in-game posters to the Pip-Boy's interface, was directly inspired by a specific style of 1950s corporate illustration. The optimistic, rounded, simplified style of those illustrations was used extensively by corporations and government agencies of the era to communicate complex or potentially frightening information in reassuring terms. The original designer of the Vault Boy, Leonard Boyarsky, has spoken about the intention behind the design: to create a mascot that embodied the particular hypocrisy of a culture that was preparing for nuclear war while maintaining a facade of optimistic normalcy. The Vault Boy's thumbs up, seen in the context of mushroom cloud imagery and radiation warning posters, is not a straightforward cheerful gesture. It is a parody of cheerfulness in the face of catastrophe, the propaganda aesthetic of a civilization that is lying to itself about what it is doing. This is easy to miss because the design is so well executed that it works as both the thing it is parodying and the parody of that thing simultaneously. The Vault Boy is genuinely appealing as a visual design. He would work as actual corporate mascot aesthetics. The critique is embedded in the deployment rather than in the design itself, and you only get the full meaning when you put the cute mascot in the context of vaults designed as human experiment chambers and advertisements for nuclear disaster preparedness. The franchise's most consistent philosophical interest, the question of what survives catastrophe and whether it is worth preserving, connects to a real tradition of post-apocalyptic thought that predates video games by decades. The specific anxiety that Fallout articulates, that civilization's worst qualities, its tendency toward hierarchy and exploitation and self-destructive ideological certainty, are also its most durable qualities, is an anxiety that appears throughout 20th century literature and political philosophy. What Fallout adds to this tradition is the interactivity. The player does not simply observe whether the worst of civilization survives. The player decides. You can rebuild Megaton or blow it up. You can support the NCR or oppose it. You can help the Brotherhood or betray it. You can save people or exploit them. The game's response to the philosophical question is to put the player in the position of being the one who determines what survives. This is either an optimistic or a pessimistic design, depending on what you do with it. The optimistic reading is that people, given the choice, will choose better. The pessimistic reading is that the game accurately reflects the way power actually works. Not through inevitability, but through the choices of specific people at specific moments, which could always have gone differently. The fact that the Fallout games have multiple endings, most of which involve some kind of compromise or failure, suggests the designers were not purely optimistic. But the fact that some endings are genuinely better than others suggests they were not purely pessimistic either. The philosophy of Fallout is somewhere in between. Things are not inevitable, but they are hard, and the cost of making them better is always borne by someone. Todd Howard mentioned at the 2016 DICE Summit that the idea for the settlement system in Fallout 4 came partly from the development team's observation of how players had used the building mechanics in games like DayZ and Minecraft, that given open-ended tools and a reason to build, people would build. The settlement system was designed to give players both the tools and the narrative reason. What is less known is that the settlement system was also influenced by the development team's own experience of playing Fallout 3 in New Vegas and being frustrated by the impossibility of making any lasting positive impact on the world. You could save Diamond City or Megaton, but the structural conditions that made those places precarious remained. The settlement system was in some ways an attempt to give the player a form of agency that the previous games did not offer. The ability to actually build something that would last, to make material change in the world rather than only narrative change. Whether it succeeded is a matter of ongoing debate in the community. The settlement system is one of Fallout 4's most divisive elements. Some players found it exactly what they had been waiting for. Others found it a distraction from the narrative experience. But the intention behind it, the design question it was answering, is a real and serious one about what players want from open-world post-apocalyptic games and what kinds of agency are meaningful. The Fallout franchise is 30 years old this year, and in that time it has been made by different studios, under different ownership, with different technologies and different design philosophies. The fact that it has maintained a recognizable identity through all of that is not an accident. It is the result of a set of core commitments that have persisted from Black Isle through Bethesda and Obsidian and into whatever comes next. Those commitments are: the world before the apocalypse should be ambivalent. The factions should be comprehensible even when they are terrible. The humor should be dark enough to cost something. The darkness should be real enough to matter. The player's choices should have weight even when they cannot be undone. And somewhere in every game, there should be a small human detail, a family of skeletons, a cat who survived, a holotape of children's voices that reminds you what was actually lost. These commitments are what make the franchise worth the hundreds of hours players pour into it. They are what make the hidden layers worth finding. They are what make this, of all the game series you could spend your late nights with, the one that rewards the patient explorer, the careful reader, the person willing to go off the main road and see what is waiting in the irradiated dark. There are 150 mysteries in the title of this video, and if you have been counting, you may have noticed that we have moved through them at the pace of the wasteland itself, slowly, with long pauses to look at the detail of things. The individual secrets numbered within the sections, the hallucinations in the Dunwich borers, the photographs of Deacon, the whispered ambient music of the capital wasteland, the architecture of Vault 11's political tragedy, the ink spots playing over the bones of Washington, all of these are in there. Some you found. Some washed over you like the ambient score of the wasteland itself, present without being analyzed. That is how the best secrets in Fallout work. You absorb them. You carry them with you. And then one day, much later, you are thinking about something else entirely and one of those quiet details surfaces, and you understand it differently than you did the first time, because you have more context now, because the wasteland has given you more of itself in the time since. The wasteland is patient. It will wait as long as it takes. The pre-war world of Fallout ended at 2:29 in the afternoon on October 23, 2077. The bombs fell and everything changed, and nothing that came after was the same as what came before, and yet something persisted. In every corner of every game in this series, something persists. Stories, objects, places, a cat in a market stall, a family by a dead fire, a scientist's holotape of herself doing science in the dark. These things persist because the people who made these games believed they should, because they understood that what we keep of a lost world tells us what we valued in the world we still have. Go softly through the wasteland tonight. There is always something else waiting if you are willing to look. War never changes, but the stories it leaves behind, the things people did and made and loved and lost, those change everything. They are the reason we keep returning to the rubble, keep reading the terminal entries, keep following the small paths that lead away from the main road into the unmarked quiet of places nobody else has gone. There is always something there. There is always something worth finding. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this slowly, in the dark, at whatever hour it is where you are. If you found something in this that you want to take into the wasteland with you, or if there is a Fallout mystery that you think we missed, leave it in the comments. We will go looking. And if you want more of this, more long, slow dives into the hidden layers of games and the worlds they build, subscribe. We will keep going as long as you want to keep listening. The wasteland is very large. We have a long way still to walk. End of script. Bonus Section 1. The vaults nobody visits. There is a particular emotional experience that comes with entering a vault in any Fallout game. The heavy door, the descent, the lighting that shifts from harsh exterior radiation to the artificial fluorescent promise of controlled environment. And then, usually, what that promise costs. The vaults are the franchise's most consistent storytelling device. Each one is a laboratory, each one is a horror. And across all the games in the series, the vaults that receive the least attention from players, the ones that are not on the main quest path, not famous for a particular dramatic encounter, not associated with a major faction, often contain the series' most careful and most disturbing work. Vault 77 exists in Fallout lore primarily through a webcomic that Bethesda published as supplementary material during the Fallout 3 era. The vault contained a single man and a shipment of crates filled with puppets. One man, one shipment. The experiment presumably was to see what would happen when you gave a human being no other humans to relate to and replaced them with representations of humans instead. The Puppet Man, as he became known, survived for years in Vault 77. The webcomic documents his adaptation, how he assigned personalities to the puppets, how he conducted conversations with them, how he built a social world out of materials that could not respond to him. The result is not madness in the simple sense. It is something more unsettling. A perfectly functioning social simulation occupied by one participant. A man who became so good at having a relationship with objects that represented people that the line between the simulation and the thing it simulated became difficult for him to locate. He eventually left the vault. The comic documents his emergence into the wasteland. His reaction to other humans after years with only puppet versions of them is not the reaction of someone who has been starved of contact. It is the reaction of someone who has developed expectations about human behavior based on his experience with puppets, which he controlled completely, and who finds actual humans disorienting because they do not behave according to his expectations. This is one of the most psychologically precise things the Fallout series has ever done, and it was done in a webcomic that most players who entered the franchise through the three-dimensional games have never read. Vault 92, in the capital wasteland of Fallout 3, is accessible but often underexamined. The premise is that the vault was designed to preserve the world's greatest musicians, a group of artists sealed away for future generations. The truth, as with all Vault-Tec experiments, is different. The vault was being used to test the effects of subliminal messaging through white noise, specific frequencies embedded in ambient sound, inaudible as distinct signals but detectable by the subconscious, designed to implant suggestions of violence. The experiment was a success in one sense. The musicians were conditioned toward violence. The vault population eventually turned on itself. The bodies that remain in Vault 92 are those of people who were, before the experiment, perhaps the most skilled practitioners of an art form that is at the opposite end of the human experience from violence. The juxtaposition is deliberate, but what the terminal entries reveal, and what most players miss because reading every terminal entry in a vault takes patience, is that the experiment produced an unexpected finding. The musicians developed resistance to the white noise conditioning faster than the general population samples that Vault-Tec had used in preliminary testing. The researchers, documented in their own terminal entries, were puzzled and frustrated by this. They had theories about why people trained to listen carefully, to discriminate between subtle differences in sound, might develop faster aversive responses to the subliminal frequencies. Those theories are documented. The researchers did not survive to follow up on them. Vault 87 in Fallout 3 was designed for a specific purpose that is directly revealed. It was a test site for the forced evolutionary virus. The population was to be transformed into super mutants. This is not hidden. The Vault's mission is in its name, in its terminals, in the physical evidence of the transformation chambers. What is hidden is the timeline. Reading the terminal entries of Vault 87 carefully produces a picture of how long the transformation process took and what the residents' experience of it was in the early stages. The first entries are about the FEV distribution mechanisms, how it was introduced into the air supply, the food supply, the water. The residents initially did not know. The first symptoms were logged in medical terminals by the Vault's own medical staff, who were conducting what they believed was general health monitoring. Then the medical entries change. The symptoms being documented are not standard physiological complaints. They are the early stages of FEV transformation. and the medical staff, who had presumably been told they were monitoring a routine health study, begin to understand what they are actually looking at. Their last entries are the most disturbing documents in the vault, the writing of people who have just understood that they and everyone they know are subjects of an experiment whose outcome they can now predict. Vault 81, which appears in Fallout 4 and contains the companion Curie, has a surface-level narrative that is warm and relatively straightforward. A functioning vault community, isolated from the outside world, managing well enough. But the hidden history of Vault 81, discoverable in locked rooms and archive terminals that require high-level lockpicking or hacking, is darker. Vault 81 was designed to test experimental medical treatments, using the vault's population as test subjects. The overseer who inherited the experiment was a man of principle who refused to implement the program. He destroyed the test subjects and the records and sealed the research wing, and then led the community in maintaining the fiction that the vault was simply what it appeared to be, a shelter. The locked section that contains Curie was his compromise. Allow the research robot to continue her work in isolation, but never use her results on unwilling subjects. The conflict between the original design and the overseer's moral stand is visible in the architecture of the vault if you know where to look. The sealed corridors, the destroyed records, the medical wing that is not accessible from the main community. Vault 81 is a vault that refused its own experiment, and the community that resulted from that refusal is healthier and more functional than almost any other vault community in the franchise. The moral choice had a practical consequence that the experiment designers did not anticipate: that vaults run humanely might actually produce better human beings. Vault 95 in Fallout 4 was designed for addicts, not people who had addiction histories, people who were actively struggling with substance dependence at the time they entered the vault. They were told the vault was a recovery facility, which was partially true. The vault did provide clean conditions and support resources. For years, the residents worked through their addictions, and the program appeared to be succeeding. And then Vault-Tec opened a sealed room. The room was full of every substance the residents had been recovering from. Every chemical, every synthetic drug, every stimulant, stacked on shelves behind a door that opened without warning or explanation in a community of people who had spent years working toward sobriety. The resulting collapse of Vault 95 is documented in the terminal entries. It is rapid and it is total. Not everyone fell. Some residents tried to destroy the newly revealed supply. Some tried to defend those who were struggling. The social fracture was immediate and irreversible, and the community that had been the Vault's most visible success became, within weeks, the Vault's most complete failure. This is the most deliberately cruel of all the Vault experiments in the series. Every other experiment at least maintains the fiction of doing something useful. Vault 95 was designed specifically to break the recovery it had enabled. The cruelty is structural, not personal. No Vault-Tec employee hated the residents of Vault 95. They just wanted to know what would happen. Vault 101 in Fallout 3 is the vault the player begins in, and its experiment is simple. The vault was never meant to open. The residents were to be sealed inside indefinitely, with each generation believing that the outside world remained too dangerous to enter. The Overseer maintained this fiction by controlling information, by enforcing the story of a hostile external world, by treating the vault as the entire universe. The social structure that this produced is visible in the relationships you have with the vault's residents in the opening sequence. Everyone you know has been born here. Everyone you know has accepted the vault as the definition of the world. The children who grew up in Vault 101 genuinely believe, in most cases, that there is no viable life outside. This belief is not stupidity. It is the result of a perfectly controlled information environment managed over multiple generations. What the experiment says, without saying it, is that any information environment maintained with sufficient control will produce genuine belief in its inhabitants. The residents of Vault 101 are not gullible people who failed to think critically. They are people who were never given information that would have allowed them to think critically about the information they were given. The difference is important, and the game, to its credit, treats the residents' worldview with sympathy rather than contempt. Bonus Section 2. The Robots of the Wasteland. The robotic characters that populate the Fallout universe are, like everything else in these games, more carefully constructed than they initially appear. From Protectrons to Mr. Handys to Securitrons, the robots of the Wasteland carry their own histories and their own hidden dimensions. Codsworth, The Mr. Handy who greets you at the beginning of Fallout 4 has been alone at your house for 210 years. This is stated explicitly in the game, but what is not fully drawn out in the main narrative is what 210 years of solitary maintenance actually did to him. The house he has been maintaining is in a state of careful preservation, which is impressive and also, when you think about it, heartbreaking. He has been polishing a car that will never run again. He has been maintaining a lawn that no one walks on. He has been doing the work of a domestic servant in the absence of anyone to serve, because the work is what he knows, and doing it keeps him grounded in something that existed before the world changed. His dialogue in the early game is cheerful. He is genuinely glad to see you, but there are moments, in extended conversation with him, where the 210 years become audible in his responses, not as expressed trauma, but as a certain quality of patience that borders on something else. He has been very patient for a very long time. He has been patient about things that no patient was ever meant to resolve. The house is immaculate and empty, and he has kept it immaculate and empty for 2 centuries, and you arriving does not entirely fix that, even though it helps. Curie, as mentioned in the companion section, spent 200 years alone in her laboratory. But her experience of that time is functionally different from Codsworth's, in a way that the game gestures toward without fully articulating. Codsworth was maintaining. Curie was doing. The distinction matters for understanding what 200 years of solitude produces in a robot. Codsworth had a purpose that was relational, serving a family, and the family was gone. Curie had a purpose that was intrinsic to herself, doing research, and the research was there even if no one was watching. She was not maintaining the memory of something lost. She was building, slowly and alone, a body of knowledge that she believed had value independent of whether anyone would ever use it. This explains the quality of her curiosity when she emerges into the Commonwealth. She is not traumatized by her isolation. She is energized by the new variables. The wasteland is a bigger laboratory than the vault was, and she is approaching it with the same methodology she has been applying for 2 centuries. She is, in a strange way, the most psychologically intact person in Fallout 4, because her sense of purpose never depended on external validation. The Protectrons that patrol various pre-war facilities across the games, still doing their jobs after 200 years, are one of the franchise's most quietly funny and most quietly melancholy images. A Protectron guarding a store that has no merchandise. A Protectron policing a traffic pattern that no vehicles use. A Protectron enforcing safety protocols in a facility where everyone who needed to be kept safe is bones. They are doing exactly what they were programmed to do. They are, in the strictest sense, functioning. Their programming is intact. Their purpose is intact. The context that gave their purpose meaning is gone, and they have no mechanism for registering that absence. This is the mechanical version of the Andale cannibals' normalcy, a behavior that was once appropriate, continued past the point where appropriateness applies, because nothing in the system registers the change. The franchise's treatment of this dynamic is usually played for black comedy, and it works as comedy. But it is also, if you let it be, a meditation on what purpose means and what happens when the purpose outlives its context. Yes Man in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most unusual characters in the franchise. He is a Securitron, a combat robot, who has been reprogrammed to be incapable of refusing requests. His personality is cheerful, helpful, and existentially strange. A being who was built for violence and then stripped of the capacity to apply it for self-interested reasons, who can only act when someone else decides he should. The option to use Yes Man to take over New Vegas independently is the most philosophically unusual ending in the game, because it places the player in the position of the person who decides what Yes Man should do with a city. He will implement whatever you want. He genuinely cannot oppose it. And the question the game puts to you, without asking it explicitly, is whether being the person who makes all the decisions for a community you nominally liberate is actually different from being Mr. House. The player who chooses the independent ending through Yes Man is making a decision that the game does not evaluate for you. It presents it as a victory screen, as an achievement of autonomy. The darker reading, available but not required, is that you simply replaced one benevolent autocrat with yourself. The RoboBrain is one of the more disturbing technical achievements of the pre-war world that the Fallout games document. It is a robot whose central processing unit is a preserved human brain, extracted from a living person and placed in a machine chassis. The brain interface allows for more sophisticated decision-making than a purely artificial intelligence. The ethical implications are not addressed in the game's marketing materials, which treat the RoboBrain as simply a useful technology. The terminal entries in locations where RoboBrains were developed or maintained tell a different story. The process of brain extraction was not entirely voluntary in all cases. The soldiers whose brains were used for military RoboBrains were technically volunteers, but the conditions under which that volunteering occurred are documented in ways that suggest the decision was not always fully informed. Some of the preserved brains retained more than the expected cognitive functions. There are notes in development terminals that describe unexpected emotional responses from units that were supposed to process only tactical information. The RoboBrain is Fallout's clearest image of the kind of technological development that precedes past ethical limits because the ethical limits are not formalized in institutional policy. Nobody decided RoboBrains were acceptable. The project simply moved forward because it was technically possible and practically useful, and the questions that should have stopped it were never asked loudly enough. Bonus Section 3. The Things That Watch. The Fallout games contain a recurring motif that most players process but do not consciously register: the sense of being observed by the world's history. Everywhere you go, something is watching. The portraits on the walls of pre-war buildings have not decayed. The advertising mascots on billboards still smile. The surveillance cameras in abandoned facilities still track movement. The world that ended is still looking at the world that came after. The security cameras in many Fallout 4 locations are still operational after 200 years. They track you as you move. In locations where there is an active computer system, the cameras feed to a terminal that is still logging footage. If you hack these terminals, you can watch the footage. You can see yourself, from the camera's perspective, moving through the environment you just moved through. This creates a strange experience of temporal doubling. You watch yourself from the perspective of the surveillance infrastructure of the pre-war world, a world that was watching its own citizens with extraordinary thoroughness and that is still watching whoever comes through 200 years later. The cameras do not distinguish between authorized visitors and post-war scavengers. They log everyone. They log you. The implication, present but not stated, is that the data exists. Somewhere in the Commonwealth's remaining computational infrastructure, footage exists of every visitor to every still operational facility. Somewhere in that data, the story of the post-war world is being recorded, one security camera at a time, with no one watching the recordings. The portrait paintings in certain locations, particularly the Museum of History and the formal rooms of Vault-Tec's offices, are still intact 200 years after the war. The subjects of those portraits stare out from their frames at whatever the room has become. A pre-war executive in a formal portrait gazes over the rubble of their conference room. A founding family portrait regards the raider gang that has moved into what was once a grand house. These portraits were placed deliberately by the art team, and their placement always communicates something about the relationship between the pre-war world and the post-war world that occupies its spaces. The executive portrait over the raider camp is a statement about succession and continuity and the dark comedy of what persistence means. The family portrait in a house where a small tragedy is documented in the environmental details is a reminder of the specificity of what was lost. Not a generic family, but this family, with faces, whose story has a before and an after. The billboards and posters that still display their pre-war advertising are one of the franchise's most consistent aesthetic elements. Nuka-Cola posters, Abraxo cleaner ads, Vault-Tec recruitment materials. These are all still there, 200 years later, in varying states of decay. Some are remarkably preserved, some are torn and faded. All of them are still recognizable. What they do, over hundreds of hours of play, is create the sense that the world's advertising infrastructure is more durable than its human beings. The messages of commerce, the imperative to consume, the cheerful faces selling products to people who no longer exist, outlast the civilization that produced them. This is either a comment on the resilience of commercial culture or a comment on the durability of certain kinds of message compared to the fragility of the people those messages were directed at. The Vault Boy in particular appears everywhere. He is on buildings, on containers, on Pip-Boy interfaces. He is the most recognizable image in the franchise because he is the most recognizable image in the franchise's world. The mascot of a corporation that sold safety and delivered catastrophe, still smiling over the ruins of what he was selling, still giving you the thumbs up as you walk through the world he helped design. There are surveillance systems in the wasteland that are not obvious as surveillance systems. The Protectron police units in some locations were, in their pre-war deployment, connected to a central monitoring system that logged their patrol data and allowed for real-time observation. Some of those central systems are still running in abandoned facilities. You can access them and see what the Protectrons have been logging. What they have been logging for 200 years is nothing. Empty corridors, unchanged merchandise. The same patrol routes run every day for 2 centuries in the absence of any meaningful events. The log entries are dated and time-stamped, and reading through them, even a small portion of them, produces a specific kind of vertigo, the vertigo of scale. 200 years of daily logs. 200 years of a Protectron walking the same corridors and finding nothing and continuing anyway. This is the surveillance infrastructure of a world that ended, still surveilling the world that replaced it, still watching, still logging, still waiting for something to be different than it is. Bonus Section 4. The Children of the Wasteland. The Fallout games deal with children differently than most post-apocalyptic fiction. In many works in the genre, children are absent, or they are symbols, or they are victims. In Fallout, children are often the most competent people in their communities, because they have grown up knowing the wasteland rather than mourning a world they cannot remember. Little Lamplight in Fallout 3 is a community of children, and it is one of the most peculiar locations in the franchise. The community has existed for long enough that generations have passed through it. Children who were born there, grew up there, reached the age of 16 and were forced to leave. The rule is absolute and enforced by the children themselves. Adults are not welcome. The community is entirely self-governing. The logic of Little Lamplight's establishment is partially documented in terminal entries. When the adult population of the area was killed or driven off in the early post-war period, the children who remained formed their own community because there was no alternative. The rule against adults developed gradually, as successive generations of Lamplight residents found that the adults who attempted to enter the community either did not respect its existing structure or represented threats. What Little Lamplight tells you about childhood in the wasteland is that competence and survival capability developed early, not as a matter of developmental precociousness but as a matter of necessity. The children of Lamplight are not prodigies. They are people who were asked to be capable by circumstances that did not allow for gradual readiness. The character of Cedo in Fallout 4's Nuka World DLC is easy to miss and easy to dismiss, but he is one of the more interesting minor characters in the franchise. He is a man who was raised in the Nuka World theme park by gorillas after the death of his family, and he speaks with the cadences of someone whose primary community was not human. He has a relationship with the gorillas that is genuinely familial. He does not regard them as animals in the way that most wasteland inhabitants regard animals. He regards them as people because they are his people. The DLC handles this without making Cedo a joke. His situation is unusual, but the game treats his relationships with the gorillas as real relationships with the same weight as human relationships. The gorillas themselves respond to him with protective behavior that is recognizably familial. The whole ecology of Cedo's world, the abandoned theme park section he has managed to make his home, has a quality of genuine habitat rather than exotic setting. The reason this matters is that Cedo represents something the franchise does occasionally. A character whose life does not fit the expected templates of wasteland survival and who is presented without condescension. He found a way to live. It is not the way most people live. That is fine. The children in Diamond City live in a city where they are protected by walls and by a community's commitment to their safety. But if you talk to them, many of them express a desire to leave, to see the wasteland, to understand the world they are being sheltered from. This is presented as childish impatience in most of the dialogue, the natural desire of a young person to exceed the limits of their environment. But it is also something else, if you have spent enough time in the Commonwealth to know what the wasteland is actually like. These children are being protected from something that is genuinely dangerous. Their desire to experience it is genuine and understandable, and also would very likely get them killed. The tension between protection and limitation is one that Diamond City cannot resolve, and the children's frustration with that tension is one of the most human things in the game. Their experiences are bounded by the wall in a way that the player's experience is not. The player moves freely through the same world that is sealed away from them. This creates an implicit responsibility. The player who cares about these characters is moving through a world whose realities those characters cannot access. What you do in the world you share with them, but which they cannot enter, matters to them in ways they cannot fully understand. Bonus Section 5. Last lights in the dark. There are moments in the Fallout games that arrive without warning and settle differently than everything around them. Small details that the designers could not have predicted would land the way they do, because those moments work through a kind of resonance that you cannot fully engineer. You can only create the conditions for it and trust that the player will be paying the right kind of attention at the right time. In Fallout 3, in the ruins of a building near Rivet City, there is a working terminal. Not broken, not inaccessible, just a terminal in a ruined space that has somehow maintained power for 200 years. If you log in, you find entries from a single user who was apparently a clerical worker at whatever organization occupied this building before the war. The entries document ordinary office days, meetings, administrative tasks, a complaint about a malfunctioning coffee machine, an observation about the weather. The last entry is from the day before the bombs fell. It is about a meeting that was scheduled for the following week, a meeting the writer was not looking forward to, and a hope that the weekend would be good, and a note to themselves to remember to pick up something on the way home. There is no dramatic final entry, no premonition, no eloquent farewell, just the concerns of an ordinary working day, followed by silence. The terminal has been waiting for whoever logged in to come back, and whoever logged in never came back. And 200 years later, you find their ordinary worries preserved in electronic amber, still there, still ordinary, impossibly remote, and impossibly close at the same time. In Fallout New Vegas, in the long 15 highway that connects the Mojave to the California border, there is a rest stop that has been converted into a small settlement by a group of travelers who got stranded and decided to stay. If you visit them, they will tell you about the journey they were trying to make, the place they were trying to reach, the circumstances that stopped them. What they have built in the rest stop is modest, but it is functional, and it is theirs, and the residents have developed the specific attachment to place that grows from making a home somewhere you did not intend to stay. They did not mean to be here. They are here, and the fact of their presence has transformed a rest stop into a community, slowly, through the accumulation of small decisions. This is Fallout's most understated statement about hope. That people, when stranded, sometimes build something rather than waiting to be rescued. That the accidental home becomes real through the investment of making it so. That what you did not mean to have can become, through time and effort, something worth having. The ending of Fallout 3, if you choose to sacrifice yourself to activate Project Purity, rather than asking Fox or another radiation-resistant character to do it, plays a final narration by Ron Perlman, followed by a series of slides documenting what happened to the capital wasteland after your death. The slides are the longest ending sequence in the game, and they detail outcomes based on choices you made throughout your playthrough. The places you helped, the people you assisted or failed to assist. The communities that thrived or struggled based on the small decisions you made while the main quest was claiming to be the only thing that mattered. The weight of those slides, coming after a sacrifice ending, is specific and not entirely comfortable. The things you did while the game was telling you the main quest was urgent turn out to have been the things that mattered most to the world you left behind. The settlements you helped or didn't help. The people you saved or didn't save. The small moments you chose to engage with or walked past. This is either a lesson about what heroism actually is, or it is a specific kind of narrative cruelty that makes you wish you had done more. In either case, it is one of the most quietly powerful storytelling devices in the franchise, and it works because of everything that happened before it, all the small choices that the game let you make, and that the ending suddenly reveals were being counted. The final thing worth saying about the Fallout series, the thing that runs underneath all of the secrets and lore and hidden details we have explored tonight, is this. These games were made by human beings for human beings, and the best of them are full of the particular kind of attention that humans pay to other humans when they believe those others deserve to be seen. Every skeleton arranged with care, every terminal entry written with an ear for the specific rhythms of how people actually communicate, every piece of ambient sound calibrated to produce a precise emotional texture, every companion line that rewards years of game knowledge, every joke that costs something, every moment of genuine beauty buried in the ruins of a world that ended badly. All of it is the record of people who cared about what they were making and believed that caring would be worth something to the people who eventually found it. You found it. You kept looking. The wasteland has more to give if you keep going, but what you have already found is real, and it was made for you, and it has been waiting. Good night. Script complete. Total runtime approximately 2 to 2.5 hours at measured 11 labs narration pace. Final section. Things that survived. The act of survival in Fallout is never simply a matter of biology. Things survive in the wasteland that have no right to survive, that were not built to last, that exist past their intended lifespan by some combination of accident and human care and the blind stubbornness of things that have been made well. Consider the holotapes. They are a pre-war recording medium that in our world would have been replaced by compact discs, then digital files, then cloud storage. In the Fallout universe, where the transistor's absence froze electronics development in a specific register, the holotape persisted and became the primary personal recording medium of the pre-war world. And then, when the war came, the holotapes survived. They survived because they are physically robust in a way that digital storage on fragile semiconductor chips is not. They survived because they do not require network connectivity to retrieve their contents. They survived because the devices that play them, the Pip-Boy and its predecessors, were built with the same robust physical engineering as the tapes themselves. And so the voices of the pre-war world persisted into the post-war world in a form that anyone with the right device could access. This is not accidental, either in the story's logic or in the franchise's design. The holotape is the Fallout series' chosen metaphor for how history survives catastrophe, physically, in objects that can be held and carried and played, rather than through institutional continuity or electronic infrastructure. The history of the pre-war world is not in its archives, because the archives are destroyed. It is in the recordings that people made of their own ordinary lives and that happen to still be playable. This is why finding a holotape in a Fallout game always carries a specific weight. You are not accessing a database. You are holding something that someone made that survived 200 years of radiation and entropy and violence, that still works, that still speaks. The voice on the tape is not a historical artifact. It is a message that was waiting for someone to find it and listen. You listened. The message arrived. Something survived. What the Fallout games are, when you strip away the gameplay mechanics and the combat systems and the level design, is a meditation on what it costs to keep things and what it costs to lose them. The vaults were built to keep things: people, knowledge, genetic diversity. Most of them failed in various ways, and what survived from them was often not what was intended. The settlements in the wasteland are attempts to keep things, to hold communities together against entropy and violence, and the slow attrition of a world that is actively hostile to the project of civilization. Most of them are fragile, and the player's involvement with them always carries the awareness that fragility. But things survive. Buildings that should have collapsed are still standing. Records that should have been lost are still readable. Robots that should have broken down long ago are still performing their functions. Communities that should have torn themselves apart have not. And people, the most fragile and most stubborn things in the wasteland, keep building and arguing and loving and creating in the middle of ruins. The Fallout games, at their best, are about that stubbornness. Not the triumphant stubbornness of heroic narrative, but the quiet daily stubbornness of people who have chosen to keep going. Codsworth maintaining the house for 200 years. Curie doing her research alone. The survivors and the rest stopped building something where they did not mean to stay. The cat in Rivet City Market being a cat, refusing to be anything other than what she is. This is the secret that the 150 hidden mysteries of Fallout are all pointing toward when you have walked through all of them and let them settle. The game is asking what you keep and why. It is asking what, in a world where everything has been lost, is still worth preserving. The answer is different for every player. It is always personal. It is always, in some way, the thing you brought into the wasteland with you from outside. The wasteland takes many things. It gives back what you are still looking for. Good night, Wanderer. The wasteland will be there when you wake up, wide and strange and full of stories you have not found yet. It always is. Appendix. Small things worth knowing. There are details that do not fit neatly into any section but that deserve their own space. Small truths about the Fallout universe that come from the margins of the game's creation and that illuminate something about how these worlds are built. The Vault Boy's thumb position in his iconic pose has been the subject of genuine discussion. The thumbs up is universally understood as a positive gesture in the Western cultural tradition, but it is also, in the context of nuclear testing of the 1950s era, a gesture associated with the personnel who observed nuclear test blasts at close range. They would hold a thumb up and close one eye to compare the apparent size of the thumb to the fireball, using this as a rough measurement of the blast's estimated yield. The higher the thumb appeared relative to the fireball, the safer the assumed distance. The Vault Boy's thumbs up, in this context, is not a cheerful greeting. It is the measurement gesture of someone standing at the edge of a nuclear detonation, checking their distance. This interpretation may or may not have been part of the original design intent. The original designer, Leonard Boyarsky, has not confirmed or denied it, but the historical association is documented, and whether or not the Fallout designers were aware of it when creating the gesture, the association is real, and it adds a specific quality to the Vault Boy's most recognizable pose. The phrase, war never changes, is one of the most quoted lines in gaming history, but the line has a history within the franchise that extends beyond Ron Perlman's delivery. The line appears in different forms in different games, delivered by different people in different contexts. Sometimes it introduces the game's opening narration. Sometimes it appears at the end, in the closing sequence, as a final observation after everything that has happened. What the line does across the franchise, through repetition and variation, is become something more than a tagline. It becomes an argument. The first time you hear it, in Fallout 1, it is a statement about the nature of human conflict. By the time you have played multiple games in the series and heard the line in multiple contexts, it has become a question. Is this actually true? The games themselves seem to be examining whether war never changes, putting the player in situations where the question has practical implications. The player who has been through Fallout New Vegas's endings, who has navigated the negotiations between factions and the choices about what kind of peace is possible and what it costs, hears the line differently at the end of that game than they did at the beginning. Either the line is correct, in which case everything that just happened was inevitable, or it is wrong, in which case the choices made a difference. The game refuses to confirm which. The save system in Fallout games has a hidden emotional dimension that most players do not consciously register, but that shapes how the game is experienced. Because Fallout games allow you to save anywhere at any time, players develop idiosyncratic save habits. Some save constantly. Some only save at resting points. Some allow themselves to live with the consequences of their decisions without reloading. The choice of how to save is also a choice about what kind of story you are telling. The player who saves before every decision and reloads when the outcome is unfavorable is telling a story in which they are a protagonist who makes optimal choices. The player who accepts consequences, who lets the decision stand regardless of outcome, is telling a story in which they are a person who makes choices and lives with them. The franchise's best moments tend to hit hardest for the second kind of player, because the emotional weight of those moments depends on irreversibility. If you can reload, if you can undo, the decision does not fully cost. The games were designed with the knowledge that most players would use saves as narrative control tools, and the designers still built moments that are designed to matter even when you know you could undo them. The moments that work, that hit despite the save system's existence, are designed to make you not want to reload, to make the cost feel like something that should be paid. They work by making the outcome feel true rather than merely unfortunate. The Fallout franchise has one of the most dedicated modding communities in gaming, and the mods that players have created for these games represent an enormous body of creative work that extends and responds to what the developers built. But what is often overlooked is the conversation that exists between the mods and the games themselves, the ways in which the modding community has influenced the franchise's subsequent development. Bethesda has acknowledged, in various interviews, that player mods have demonstrated design possibilities that were then incorporated into official game design. The settlement system in Fallout 4 was influenced in part by what players had been doing with modded settlement tools in earlier games. The expanded companion relationships in later games were informed by the companion mods that players had built for games where the official companion systems were less developed. This means the Fallout games are, in a meaningful sense, co-created. The version of Fallout that exists in 2026 is partially shaped by what players wanted and made themselves when the official product did not give it to them. The franchise is in dialogue with its community, and the community's labor has contributed to the finished product in ways that are rarely formally acknowledged. One of the most personal Easter eggs ever discovered in a Bethesda game is in Fallout 3. Todd Howard's infant son, Jake Howard, voiced the lone wanderer as a baby in the opening sequence of the game. The babbling and infant sounds that accompany the game's first moments, before your character has grown up enough to have a voice actor, were recorded from a real infant, the game director's own child. This is not disclosed anywhere in the game. It is not in the credits in a prominent place. It was revealed in an interview years after the game's release. The moment that introduces every player to the Fallout 3 universe, the opening sequence in Vault 101 features the sound of a real child making real sounds in the studio of his parents' workplace. The Lone Wanderer's first sounds in the world are the sounds of a real person, a specific real person, who was there for reasons that have nothing to do with the fiction. The character and the person overlap in that opening moment in a way that is impossible to fully separate once you know it. The Lone Wanderer's cry is Jake Howard's cry. The game begins with something real hidden inside something fictional, which is, when you think about it, exactly how the best Fallout moments work. The sense of history that the Fallout franchise manages to create, a sense that 200 years of post-war life have actually passed and produced an actual civilization, is achieved through a technique that the designers have never formally named, but that shows up consistently across the series. The technique is this: every major faction, every major settlement, every major cultural development that the player encounters in the games is presented as having existed for longer than the player has been involved in it. The NCR did not start when you arrived in New Vegas. It has been building for generations. Diamond City did not begin when you walked through its gates. The Brotherhood of Steel was not organized in response to your arrival in the Commonwealth. All of these things existed before you, and they will continue after you unless your choices actively determine otherwise. Your protagonist is not the origin of the story. You are a late arrival to a story that was already in progress. This design philosophy is one of the things that makes the Fallout games feel different from many open-world games, where the protagonist's arrival is implicitly treated as the beginning of meaningful history in the game world. In Fallout, you arrive in the middle of something, and the sense of that middle, of the weight of what has already happened before you got there, is one of the franchise's most carefully maintained illusions. The water. This is worth spending a moment on. Throughout the Fallout games, water is both a resource and a symbol. Clean water is rare and valuable in the wasteland, because 200 years of radiation and contamination have made most surface water dangerous. The search for clean water, the processing of irradiated water, the political economy of water sources, runs through multiple games as a subplot or a main quest element. But water is also used atmospherically, in ways that go beyond its mechanical function. The sound of water in Fallout games is almost always peaceful. Rain, which occurs in Fallout 4's Commonwealth, changes the acoustic character of the environment in ways that create a temporary respite from the wasteland's typical tension. Indoor water features, rare as they are, create pools of quiet in spaces that would otherwise be silent. The franchise seems to understand something that the pre-war world forgot: that clean water is not a resource to be taken for granted. The post-war world's relationship to water is honest in a way that the pre-war world's relationship to water was not, because the post-war world knows exactly what happens when you run out of it or contaminate it. This knowledge runs through the wasteland's culture, and you absorb it over hundreds of hours of play, until the sound of running water in a Fallout game means something specific that it does not mean in other contexts. The final secret worth carrying out of the wasteland tonight is the most personal one. The Fallout games are designed to be experienced alone, typically, in the specific solitude of a player and a screen in the quiet of personal time. This is not accidental. The games are tuned for a particular kind of attention that is difficult to sustain in social contexts. The slow reading of terminal entries, the careful tracking of audio details, the willingness to follow small paths away from the main road. That specific attention, that quality of patient engagement with a detailed world, is something the franchise rewards over time. The player who has spent 500 hours in Fallout's wasteland knows things about it that the player who has spent 20 hours does not, and the knowing is qualitatively different, not just more information but a different relationship to the world. The wasteland becomes something you have a history with, something you have been through things with, something that has given you things you carry. You carry them tonight. You have been carrying them this whole time, through all the vaults and all the holotapes and all the skeletons arranged by careful hands to tell silent stories. You know more about the wasteland than you did at the beginning of this, and the wasteland is wider than it was before. That widening does not stop. The franchise is 30 years old and growing. The mysteries are not running out. There is always another terminal to hack, another unmarked location to find, another holotape to play in the dark. You know the way. You have the Pip-Boy. The wasteland is very large. Go well, Wanderer. You are never alone out there.